Good morning. Ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Subcommittee will come to order. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today we are taking a more in-depth look at several issues related to the FDA user fee programs. First, we will hear about FDA's accelerated approval process for certain new drugs that treat serious or life-threatening illnesses and provide a greater therapeutic benefit over existing drugs and therapies. Accelerated approval has been successful in speeding cancer and HIV/AIDS drugs to market, and I'm particularly interested in how the process can be better utilized for rare diseases. Earlier this week, Representative Stearns, along with Representatives Bilbray and Towns, introduced the Faster Access to Specialized Treatments, the FAST Act, to help expedite new drugs through the approval process. We will also hear about FDA's regulation of medical gas and the need for targeted regulations for these substances due to their differences from most drugs. Representative Lance has introduced H.R. 2227, the Medical Gas Safety Act, which would reform the current FDA regulation of medical gases to create an appropriate process for medical gases to be approved. It would also remove the current regulatory uncertainty for medical gases by establishing targeted regulations that take into account the unique characteristics of medical gases. Representative Lance's bill is bipartisan. It is co-sponsored by members of the full committee from both sides of the aisle. Next, we will address the lack of new antibiotics in the pipeline and how Congress and FDA can act to incentivize new antibiotic development. Dr. Gingrich's Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now Act, or the GAIN Act, H.R. 2182, targets this problem. This bill would extend the exclusivity period for new prescription antibiotics and add an additional 6-month period of exclusivity for a manufacturer if the new antibiotic identifies a companion diagnostic test. The GAIN Act also has bipartisan support, including 8 Democrats and 15 Republicans from the full committee. Finally, the subcommittee will hear about the dangers and weaknesses to the current pharmaceutical supply chain, from manufacturers to distributors to pharmacies, and how best to ensure that counterfeit, adulterated, or stolen drugs do not end up in the hands of patients. Representative Bilbray and Representative Matheson are currently working in this area, and Dr. Cassidy's Online Pharmacy Safety Act, H.R. 4095, aims to educate the public about which internet pharmacies are known to be safe and legitimate. We have 3 panels today. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here. I look forward to their testimony. Who do I yield to? And so at this time, recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Health, Mr. Plone, for 1 minute.
Is it just a minute?
No, it's 5 minutes.
5, right?
Oh, 5 minutes, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Thank you, Chairman Pitts. Today we're holding another hearing to examine important FDA-related issues that could be considered as a part of the user fee agreements, or the UFA legislation. These include changes to the current expedited approval process for new drugs, the regulation of medical gases, antibiotic drug development, and the downstream pharmaceutical supply chain. It's my hope that our witnesses will help the subcommittee examine the ways in which these issues can be or should be addressed in our upcoming legislation. Accelerated approval is one of the processes by which the FDA approves certain new drug applications that offer meaningful therapeutic benefit over existing treatments for serious or life-threatening diseases. This process has been responsible for the great strides in medicines to treat HIV and cancer, and has provided patients with speedier access to important new medicines. According to the FDA, over 80 new products have been approved under accelerated approval since the program was established, including 29 drugs to treat cancer, 32 to treat HIV, and 20 to treat various other conditions. There are also 2 other programs that help expedite the approval of certain promising investigational drugs known as Fast Track and Priority Review. Some have stated the accelerated approvals may be working for certain conditions, but it had limited success in developing medicines to treat other rare diseases. As such, we'll examine different proposals today that would clarify and improve some of FDA's authorities. While I'm open to such proposals, it's important to note that any changes we make must not lower the safety or effectiveness standards by which FDA approves new medicines. Today, we will also discuss the regulation of medical gases. Medical gases are among some of the most widely prescribed drugs and have been in use since before the enactment of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. Many of these, for example, oxygen, are often used with other medical products such as a device. As I understand it, most of these core gases have been marketed for many years without an approved new drug application. According to the industry, medical gases are different than other traditional drugs and should be treated as such. Therefore, they have proposed a new regulatory system for dealing with medical gases, which would cover things like good manufacturing practices, labeling, distribution, registration, listing, and product tracking requirements. I believe there's a great value to this conversation so that members can understand the issues involved. However, I wonder whether an entirely new regulatory system is the answer. I'm going to need some of these antibiotics, Mr. Chairman. Antibiotic development of drugs is a critical public health issue. As chairman of the subcommittee last Congress, we held a hearing on the increasing of antibiotic resistance and its threat to public health. Unfortunately, the nation's ability to counter this threat could be limited because of the lack of antibiotics being developed. Antibiotics were among the most impactful medical innovations of the 20th century. A routine treatment to combat bacterial infections, they are one of the main contributors in the decline of infectious diseases. But bacteria are living organisms, and as such, they can and will mutate with time to be able to resist the drugs that have been developed to combat them. We now find ourselves in a situation where our triumph over infectious disease is in jeopardy. More and more bacteria are proving to be resistant to the antibiotics currently on the market. I'm eager to hear from FDA and witnesses today about the proposed legislation that would create financial incentives for companies to develop more antibiotic drugs and spur advancement of these products, particularly whether that approach will help to solve the issues our system face, but also what would be the shortfalls of that approach. For example, how do we limit the uses of these new antibiotics so that we don't see the same type of resistance we're seeing now with old medicines? And one of the more complicated but critical issues is the downstream safety of the U.S. drug supply chain. In order to ensure that we do not have counterfeit stolen drugs entering the supply chain and harming patients, this committee has heard for a long time about the call for greater oversight of the drug supply chain. The need to set up a system that would track and trace the movement of drugs once it enters the marketplace has been the common theme. Just last month, we saw a counterfeit version of the cancer drug Avastin found in the U.S. The counterfeit did not contain the medicine's active ingredient, proving to be ineffective, and this is dangerous and in some cases life-threatening. I think we can all agree that Congress needs to get serious about securing the supply chain and that a national system is necessary to prevent these drugs from reaching patients. Some states are beginning to pass their own laws. California, for example, has a law that will go into effect in 2015. I'm interested to hear about the different approaches being proposed, specifically the positive, negatives, and feasibility of each. However, as we contemplate moving forward, we must not rush to legislation. These are really complicated and dense processes, and if we're looking at setting a national standard, it's critical that it be a strong, robust standard that is most beneficial to the consumer. So just let me close, Mr. Chairman, by thanking everyone. I look forward to our panels today. Your testimony and insight will remain useful in the months ahead. Thank you.
Chair, thanks. Gentleman yields 5 minutes to Dr. Gingrey from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding to me, and I'm going to confine my remarks to the shortages of antibiotics, and of course that's the bill that the chairman referred to. Mr. Chairman, again, I appreciate you holding this hearing and the 3 panels of witnesses. The need for new antibiotics is well established and beyond question. Antibiotic resistance is a threat to global public health as well as the United States national security. Drug-resistant bacteria, like those featured, excuse me, Representative Pallone, I think I've been stricken with the same illness. Drug-resistant bacteria like those featured in the movie Contagion threaten American patients and troops in much the same way. Whether transmitted from person to person or contracted from a biological weapon, the overall threat is the same. As a physician, I understand how important it is that medical providers use antibiotics judiciously. But no matter how judiciously we use the current supply of drugs we have or will have in the coming years, we need more. To quote the testimony of Dr. Janet Woodcock of the FDA, the United States is, and I quote her, at a critical junction with regards to drug development. We are in urgent need of new therapeutic options to treat the resistant bacteria that we currently face, and we will need new therapeutic options in the future. This critical juncture requires immediate action if we are to prevent a public health disaster from hitting our shores in the next decade. I want to thank Dr. Woodcock for being here today, and I personally thank Dr. Margaret Hamburg for her leadership on this important issue as the director of the FDA. To Dr. Woodcock's testimony, antibiotic resistance cannot be solely solved by the development of new drugs, but it also be solved without them. In fact, we can answer every other problem with regards to antibiotic resistance. But if we fail to address the lack of incentives for drug companies and research and development experts in new antibiotic drug development, let me say this emphatically, we will lose this fight. As a group of bipartisan members of Congress, my co-authors and I have forwarded H.R. 2182, the Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now, or GAIN Act, to encourage new drug development. The legislation is a product of years of thoughtful consideration, and it strikes a balance between the need for drug companies' incentives and the needs and requirements of good public health policy. That balance is attested to in the nearly 50 organizations that currently support our effort. Their testimonials, which I will be entering into the record shortly, underscore the potential that the GAIN Act holds to ensure patients will continue to have the life-saving medications that they need. Among those, we count public health leaders like the Pew Charitable Trust, patient organizations including Kids v. Cancer, medical providers like St. Jude's Children's Hospital in Tennessee, and organizations representing 2.5 million veterans and wounded warriors, among others. The legislation as drafted focuses incentives on a list of unmet needs and life-threatening pathogens from which infections arise. These pathogens were identified by the Infectious Disease Society of America as looming threats to public health because little or no treatment currently exists to combat the infections that they cause. The legislation also includes, and this is most important, Mr. Chairman, the legislation also includes the ability for the FDA to update this list to meet new and emerging threats so that we continue to encourage the therapeutic options that FDA will testify are needed. To be clear, drug researchers and manufacturers in early development focus their efforts on identifying products that work against an identified pathogen. As an example, it included their ability to kill a specific or a variety of deadly bacteria. Only after a compound is identified as working against a specific pathogen do the scientists then focus on infection sites in the body in order to measure the efficacy of that potential drug. Some have questioned the need to be so specific with regards to the types of killer bacteria that we are focusing on in the GAIN Act. To that issue, let me read to you a sentence from one of the many support letters we have received. The GAIN Act definition ensures that unmet medical needs get the attention they deserve in an industry where other therapeutic areas often hold greater commercial promise. However, the incentives for development decreases dramatically if we are unable to know with a high degree of certainty that a product would qualify for the incentives in the GAIN Act in early phase development. In short, our ability to demonstrate to companies the incentives in the GAIN Act as early in the drug development process as possible is the foundation upon which our efforts rest. Mr. Chairman, I've gone over time. I'll go ahead and submit the rest of my comments for the record, and I look forward to the testimony of the three panels of witnesses.
All right, the chair thanks the gentleman and yields, recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes for opening statement.
I really have just about a minute to say, but I wanted to put it on the record. I wanted to say that I strongly support the development of drugs to enhance therapeutic options for patients with rare diseases. There's no question that both patients and their families must cope with unusual and unique issues when they have a rare disease. I can appreciate the desire on the part of patient groups and their families, as well as industry, to create an accelerated approval process for drugs to treat rare diseases. I both understand and support that goal, but I also want to ensure that in seeking to accelerate drug approval, that we do not expose patients to unnecessary and unacceptable risks. While I'm committed to efforts to accelerate the development of rare disease drugs, I want to make sure we maximize drug safety efforts and that we do not encourage expedited FDA approval if doing so would jeopardize that goal. So I'm looking forward to hearing you, Dr. Woodcock, on how best to address this issue, and I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman, yield to me. Thank you very much to yielding to me. We have all the subcommittees scheduled at the same time, and I was trying to get up here as quickly as possible, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to make an opening statement because we're going to be looking at some important proposals today. And we haven't yet seen the legislative text, but the proposed list of user fee add-ons is long. And each day passes, I'm increasingly concerned about whether we'll have time to get to a bipartisan agreement on such an ambitious package of bills. The policies we'll be discussing involve complex public health issues. For us to do a responsible job on these proposals, we need time and we need bipartisan agreement. We should not rush this work. We should prioritize getting it right, not just getting it done. And if we're able to come to a bipartisan agreement in the time available, it makes sense to move them along with the other bills. Otherwise, I hope we can all agree it will be better to wait so that we don't jeopardize the passage of the underlying user fee bills. Let me turn to some specific proposals. We've learned in a series of hearings this subcommittee held in 2010 that the problem of antibiotic resistance is a dire public health threat, and our arsenal of effective antibiotics is running dangerously low. So clearly we need to look at ways to incentivize the development of new antibiotics. The GAIN Act is a good first step to achieving this goal. However, we should ensure that the bill is narrowly tailored to drugs that treat dangerous infections for which we don't have adequate treatments. Otherwise, we risk worsening the problems of resistance. We also need to ensure that the bill mandates that FDA and other agencies involved take steps to ensure the efficacy of these newly developed antibiotics is preserved once they are on the market. We'll also hear today about FDA's accelerated approval system. We can all agree that we want the most effective, innovative medicines to be available at the earliest possible time. So if there are improvements that could be made in the way FDA reviews these medicines, we should consider them. But I'm concerned that some of these proposals are driven by unsubstantiated claims that FDA has become too demanding of drug companies, requiring too much data, and thereby allegedly keeping drugs from patients and driving innovation and jobs abroad. As we've heard at previous hearings, there is apparently no reliable data to back up these claims. To the contrary, as the testimony of Friends of Cancer Research and FDA have shown, FDA actually improves novel drugs faster than its counterparts in Europe or anywhere else in the world. In the past, the National Organization of Rare Diseases has also testified about its study that FDA is quite flexible in its requirements for approving orphan drugs. We want drugs approved as quickly as possible, but we want the FDA to do its job, and it's a difficult one. We want to give you the tools, and we want you to have the flexibility to do that job as quickly as possible, at meeting the requirements of the law. I'm open to considering whether legislation can help FDA work with companies to get more breakthrough medicines to patients more quickly. However, we need to ensure that any adjustments don't alter FDA's approval standards. Today's hearing will also examine efforts to improve the integrity of our drug supply chain. This is an important issue. There's a regulatory void at the federal level because the U.S. does not currently have laws requiring the tracking and tracing of pharmaceuticals. Consequently, some states have stepped in and enacted their own laws. And we're going to hear today about California, which currently has a law that would mandate one of the most robust pedigree systems in the country. Many have suggested there is a need for a single federal system that would preempt these state laws. I believe having a system at the federal level could make sense if done correctly, but I have grave concerns about preempting a strong law, especially in California. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. That concludes our opening statements. Our first panel will have just one witness, Dr. Janet Woodcock, Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation Research at the FDA. We're happy to have you with us today. Dr. Woodcock, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Janet Woodcock. I'm Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA, and I really appreciate the opportunity to testify on these important issues that are before the panel. The mission of the drug program at FDA is to make sure that medicines are of high quality, safe, effective, and available. The quality of the United States drug supply has long been taken for granted by, I think, the healthcare community. But the drug supply can be threatened by poor manufacturing practices, by economically motivated substitution, as we saw in the heparin problem, and by counterfeit drugs, all problems that we have observed in the last several years and that are increasing. The FDA must continue to be vigilant to maintain the quality of drugs in this country, and we must have the proper tools to maintain a high-quality medicine supply. At the same time, health professionals and patients continue to rely on FDA standards for safety and efficacy so that the benefits and risks of medicines are studied and that they are described in the drug label at the time of approval, and that we remain vigilant for unexpected side effects once the drugs are marketed. In considering new steps to enhance FDA regulations, we should not diminish the historic protective standards for safety and efficacy that have served our patients so well. And finally, drugs should be available. The current drug shortage crisis has highlighted how important a reliable drug supply really is. The drug user fee proposals FDA has delivered to Congress are targeted to strengthen the availability of drugs for Americans. The prescription drug user fee program that Congress has authorized 4 times already has really assured that the U.S. is the leader in developing and introducing new important drugs to the public so that Americans have access to that cutting-edge science and to drugs that will treat life-threatening conditions. The new generic drug user fee proposal is intended to strengthen our generic drug user review program that provides access to affordable, high-quality drugs and also addresses FDA oversight of drug quality around the world. FDA's biosimilars program is intended to provide access to more affordable biologic drugs. While these FDA programs are strong and successful, it is clear there are continuing challenges in drug regulation, many of which will be discussed at this hearing. I look forward to working with you to find solutions that will benefit our public that we serve mutually. Thank you.
Chair, thanks the gentlelady, and I will begin the questioning and recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Woodcock, what can we do to expand accelerated approval to further help patients, including those with rare diseases?
First, let me say that the accelerated approval program has been very successful and has brought access, early access to life-saving drugs for patients with HIV, patients with cancer, and to many patients with orphan and rare diseases. However, we believe more could be done as far as clarity of use of this proposal. We have found that both in the industry, in the academic community, and even sometimes within the FDA itself, there is confusion about the use of accelerated approval. So we believe that additional clarity in the use of this would be very beneficial. We also plan to issue guidance that will also clarify the use of accelerated approval and will explain our evidence standards more clearly.
Thank you. Despite the success of accelerated approval for cancer drugs, I've talked with patients and innovators and investors, and they indicate that Some in FDA intend to limit the use of the accelerated approval pathway for cancer drugs. This is very concerning to me. As you know, if FDA goes down this path, patient access to important new cancer drugs will be decreased, and investment in new cancer therapies will continue to drop. That would be unacceptable. Rather than limiting the use of accelerated approval in cancer, shouldn't we be looking for ways to expand it? Would you please comment on this?
Certainly, and I believe we are looking for ways to expand the use of accelerated approval in cancer. For example, we will soon issue a draft guidance on the use of a new surrogate called pathologic complete response, which would be used in high-risk breast cancer as a mechanism to do accelerated approval. So I believe that we've been very successful in cancer, and in fact, over the last year, we have approved cancer drugs using accelerated approval, sometimes using what are called historical controls, which means that the drug is treated in patients and their response is compared to what would have happened if they had had standard therapy. So we are not really backing away from that. However, we have had discussions about the magnitude of the response. What does that mean? That means that if you see in a historically controlled trial, maybe you see a 5% response rate or a 10% response rate, you really don't know the amount of benefit to the patients. And so that's the level of disagreement that is going on. It's very technical, and it's within the oncology community. But please be assured we are not backing off with accelerated approval for cancer. In fact, we would like to find more endpoints that we could use for accelerated approval.
Okay, thank you. We all agree that it is important to prevent counterfeit drugs from reaching our nation's patients. What steps is the agency taking to prevent this?
We have, for a long time, had extensive efforts on counterfeits. We are working with our foreign counterparts around the globe to try and identify gaps in the supply chain and inspection coverage and so forth, have early notification between all regulatory authorities when counterfeits are discovered. Our Office of Criminal Investigations also handles a lot of investigations into counterfeit drugs. However, we do believe that additional authorities are necessary for us to be able to stem this tide.
All right. Now, you mentioned in your testimony that a system to track and trace prescription drugs through the supply chain would help ensure the integrity of our drug supply. Do you believe the most effective track and trace system would involve a uniform standard throughout the country? And what are the elements of a cost-effective system?
Because drugs are shipped all around the country and across state lines, we believe uniform standards are important, and we are developing elements of standards that we would publish as suggested standards that could be used. The most important features of track and trace are the following. Number one, that you can identify the product as it moves through the supply chain, and particularly in real time, so that patients aren't being exposed to counterfeits before you discover that they've entered the system. So that's one point. Another point is that modern drug manufacturing it makes lots of drugs, in other words, batches, but it isn't like you might think of, what you might compound or whatever. A batch may be 1 million pills or tablets or more. And so instead of a batch moving through the supply chain on a pallet, okay, a lot would be broken up and go all over the country in different. So a lot, tracking to the lot level is not that helpful, would not be that helpful if we wanted real-time detection, say of drugs that have been stolen from that lot and then diverted and re-entering the supply chain, or a copy that had been made of that lot number and then put back into the supply chain at some point. We would not be able to detect that unless we're tracking that lot as it goes along by unit, not by whole lot. So we recognize that there are trade-offs between cost of these systems and the benefits that they would provide. But if we want our patients not to get counterfeit drugs, which has happened even recently, they have been administered to cancer patients, we're going to need a system that tracks to the unit level and identifies the movement of the drugs in real time.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. And do you want to go first or you want to go action? The chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Plone, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, I wanted to ask you a question about the GAIN Act and then a couple of questions about medical gases. I think we can all agree that we need to find ways to encourage and facilitate development and approval of important new antibiotics. The GAIN Act is one attempt to achieve that goal. However, I know FDA and others have had concerns about the current definition of which drugs would be eligible for the incentive. I believe that IDSA and others have suggested that GAIN should be limited to new antibiotics for treating serious infections for which there is an unmet medical need. I think the focus on treating serious infections has not been controversial, but I wanted to know your views on the other two components, that the antibiotic should be a new chemical or molecular entity, and that it should meet an unmet medical need. If you could just tell me your views on that, and then I'm going to get to the medical gases. Go ahead.
A new chemical entity is simply an attempt to make sure that this incentive applies to new drugs that are being developed and not to re-studying older drugs. So I think that particular provision is really up to Congress as far as how that, but what we really need is new molecular entities or new chemical entities that have new mechanisms of action that will be put against these threats. Now, is the second question?
The other one is that it should meet an unmet medical need.
By definition, we'd want it to meet an unmet medical need. People who are facing infections where there is no current satisfactory treatment would meet the definition of an unmet medical need.
Okay. Let me get to the gases, and that's the H.R. 2227. From what I understand, medical gases are regulated by the FDA as drugs. However, because they differ in some ways from most other drugs, FDA has tried to adjust its requirements to fit them and has taken a risk-based approach to enforcement. However, the Compressed Gas Association believes that medical gases are different enough from other drugs that they warrant a new set of regulations. So that's my questions relate to that. Can you explain how FDA regulates gases now, and in particular, the commonalities and differences between your regulation of gases and your regulation of other drugs, and the safety profile of gases? And then, as I said, this bill provides for a streamlined process that would deem certain gases approved if the applicant submits a certification that the gas is among certain designated gases that are considered to be well understood and safe. So what's your view on that? And then last, what do you think about this establishing a separate regulatory system for gases that covers things like good manufacturing practices, labeling, distribution? Do you think we should have a separate system? I'm throwing these all in because we only have 2 minutes, so try to cover it if you can.
Number one, for designation, the certain uses of medical gases have been used so long in medicine that they actually didn't fall under the FDA review process that was instituted when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed. And so technically those uses are unapproved because no applications have been submitted. And so we feel for those traditional medical gases, for traditional uses, that a designation process would be useful. As far as a whole new regulatory regime for medical gases on manufacturing, we believe that might not be necessary. We believe we could work with the manufacturers, and actually I would commit to working with the manufacturers to develop an appropriate and flexible interpretation of our regulations and their application to medical gases for traditional uses that I think would be mutually satisfactory.
Obviously, one of the things that they've said to me is if there was some way that you could meet with the Compressed Gas Association to see if there's some way to accommodate their needs and eliminate the need for legislative action. I mean, you seem to be suggesting that. Is that fine?
I would be happy to meet with them personally.
All right. Let me just ask one thing. Did you respond to the question about the streamlined approval process?
What I said was that some designation process would probably be most satisfactory. These
These are for the
oxygen-
streamlined, for the ones that have been around for a while.
Exactly. We can, for all medical gases, we could conceive of high-tech new uses that actually should be studied. But traditionally, giving someone oxygen because they have low blood oxygen, it's really not that controversial.
So the streamlined would be for the ones that have been around.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognize the gentleman from Texas, Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes for
I
questions.
thank the chairman for the recognition. Dr. Woodcock, always good to see you. Last time we were together, we talked a little bit about drug shortages. And in fact, in October, the president put out an executive order, and you were kind enough to receive myself and my staff out at the FDA about a week or so later. We talked about this. This was early November. Then you came to the committee a few weeks ago, and we talked extensively about a particular shortage called Doxil or doxorubicin. I think sterile methotrexate came up in the discussions as well, and of course I was very glad to see then shortly thereafter we'd found a way to circumvent some of the problems. As you recall with Doxil, there was a difficulty in establishing bioequivalency because in order to do the studies to establish bioequivalency meant that the drug had to be taken away from patients who were dependent upon it for therapy, those patients suffering from ovarian cancer who really couldn't afford a lapse in therapy, and the FDA didn't really provide a way out of that. So now you have, and I'm grateful for that, and that involved actually, I guess, the use of some of the same compound or a similar compound that was available overseas. I'm not quite sure how the methotrexate got resolved, but I'm glad to see that it did. But you provided us with a really extensive list of drugs that were in shortage, and of course some of them were the sterile injectables, the cancer drugs, which are clearly pretty important stuff. So I guess my question to you is, and you've also testified, if I remember correctly, that this is a complex problem, and it's not the same thing causing the shortages across the board. So we look at it and say we're going to draft legislation, we're going to fix this problem, we're going to stop it. But it's difficult to do because the problems are so complex, and yet your agency had the ability to reach out somewhere and solve these two very serious problems for patients across the country. So I guess my question to you is, what can you do as a regulatory agency to go down that list? Do you have a task force that's trying to identify the most critical needs, the most critical shortages, get those things, whatever we need to do to get them through the regulatory hoops in a safe and efficient manner and get them delivered to patients in this country?
Yes, we certainly have our shortage team is really working overtime, and we have augmented that team with additional people. We have looked at every one of the drugs on the shortage list, and if we have had a generic applicant that is pending, we jump the queue, we expedite the review of that application and try to get that approved as soon as possible so that additional source could be on the market. In addition, even when a shortage is impending, we think there's an impending shortage, we will start looking at alternative supply. Can other manufacturers in the United States ramp up their production? We contact them, we talk to them. Are there ex-US manufacturers with acceptable facilities and product that could increase their production and thus cover the US drug supply as well? So we do all these.
Leonard.
Despite this, we're still experiencing shortages, primarily because a lot of facilities in the United States making sterile injectables have been experiencing manufacturing problems.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, because some of the manufacturing problems actually relate to the company's ability to get a return on investment or even break even in the process, and they say, look, it's not worth this to us to revamp our manufacturing line for this product. Is there anything you can do at the FDA as far as providing the incentive so that company will stay in the business, because then they don't have to go through the whole reapplication and all of the approval process again?
Yeah, we have very little to do with the economic side of drug production and reimbursement. We focus on making sure that the facilities and processes are in place to make a reliable drug product. I don't think that cutting corners in manufacturing sterile drug products is the answer, because the problems that these facilities have experienced are significant. They include endotoxin contamination, bacterial contamination, and particulates in injectables. And these type of problems are not, do not result in usable sterile injectables.
Okay, I'm going to need to interrupt you because time's running short. I've got some things I'm going to submit in writing about conflicts of interest, stuff we've covered before to some degree, and I've got some new questions. But can you update us on New England Journal of Medicine had an article probably back in 2010 or maybe it's 2009 on the curious case of colchicine. And colchicine, a drug that had been around for 3,000 years to treat gout and familial Mediterranean fever, as I recall. And because of some things that happened at the FDA, suddenly this drug spiked in price and was becoming more difficult for patients to receive.
That situation still continues. The FDA has something called an unapproved drugs initiative, and we're trying to get drugs that are not approved by there's no approved version by the FDA into the fold of proper drugs in the United States. And sometimes these efforts do have unintended consequences, and I certainly have heard, I'm a rheumatologist, I certainly have heard from a large amount of the community and patients about this particular issue of affordability of this medicine. We are trying to make the balance between availability and affordability and the ability to assure a reliable supply of a drug when drugs are not FDA approved and they're simply on the market. There's many opportunities for problems. So we try to walk this path, but believe me, we're very aware of the problems that have been created for patients.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Yields to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, I want to ask you about the accelerated approval. There's a bill by Mr. Towns and Mr. Stearns, and Dr. Margarnora will discuss this on our second panel. The Act would clarify and improve FDA's ability to use surrogate and clinical markers for the accelerated approval pathway. Dr. Allen, also on our second panel, describes in his testimony another approach for breakthrough products. This approach would ensure that FDA works closely with companies in helping them develop clinical trial designs that would expedite approval of important drugs showing promise in early trials. And then we also have the Infectious Disease Society of America. They submitted testimony for the record that discusses yet another approach, and this one focused on facilitating approval of drugs that would treat serious diseases in limited populations. My biggest concern in looking at these proposals is whether they do or have the potential to change the approval standard, which is something I hope we can all agree we don't want to do. Can you briefly, because I have another set of questions, describe for us what you see as any benefits of these proposals as well as any concerns you have with any of them?
On accelerated approval, as I said earlier, I think the main point is a clarity of our ability to approve drugs on an early clinical endpoint or a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. So, but I do not believe that changing the standards for safety and effectiveness would be a benefit to patients. So it's more about clarifying what approval mechanism we can use, but not changing the evidentiary standard. As far as breakthrough therapies, I've had several people who were involved in the AIDS epidemic and the development of drugs to address that epidemic say to me, if we had treated that as business as usual, we would never have solved this epidemic. We would never have gotten effective drugs available. And HIV is not the only terrible, life-threatening problem that people face. So what breakthrough therapy is not about the approval standard. It's about getting all hands on deck when we find, when early in development, a product is found to potentially have a tremendous benefit, a life-changing benefit in a serious disease. And we all should get together at that point, this is my professional opinion, and figure out the most effective and efficient way to evaluate that therapy to see if it really has the promise that it appears to have, so that if it does, patients will not have to wait years to have that
Do
therapy.
you need legislation to do that?
No. However, I believe that designating that as a very important process that the agency would have would provide benefit.
I want to ask you about the integrity of our drug supply chain and prevent safety crisis. You've already indicated you think that we ought to require drugs to be tracked all the way down to the unit level, and would only require supply chain entities track a lot number of the product. I want to ask you about the question of the pharmacies, because in the coalition bill, the pharmacies are essentially excluded from that proposal, and I'm concerned about preempting state laws as strong as California. So I'd like to know FDA's views of the importance of the differences between the two models. You've already talked about the supply chain. You might just repeat it again, but what do you think about excluding the pharmacies? And if we have a single federal system, how important do you think it is that pharmacies be included and that drugs are traced to the unit level instead of a lot level?
If our goal is to prevent our patients from receiving counterfeit drugs before they receive them, rather than going back and trying to reconstruct what happens after they have received counterfeit drugs and we have detected them, then we're going to have to have a system that is a real-time system that tracks the drugs through the system down to the pharmacy level. Why? Because diversion and insertion of counterfeits can occur at any point during the drug distribution chain. And you leave a big gap there for the criminals. We know there are a lot of criminals out there who, outside of our country, who want to make profit by putting counterfeit drugs into our distribution chain, or by stealing drugs, perhaps adulterating them, and then reinserting them back.
You would include pharmacists and pharmacies?
We have had some cases of like that.
Yeah. This is going to be expensive. And
Well-
I suppose that the technology advances quickly and gets cheaper over time. So we need to work as a robust system as possible, but realize that we've got to phase it in, I suppose.
Right. I think that there are costs, significant costs associated with it. And you have to balance the costs against the potential benefits. And I think we have to ask ourselves, are we going to wait until we have a mass sort of poisoning from insertion of counterfeit drugs, and or when do we assume those costs are the benefit worth the cost? There's no doubt that there will be costs to all members in the supply chain to do this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shemkus, 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Woodcock. My first question is kind of really is a response to an answer you gave to Congressman Pallone on the discussion of the GAIN Act. I'm an original sponsor on Dr. Gingrich's bill, along with Diana DeGette, Anna Eshoo, Gene Green, and other members, and we've been working a long time. The intent is to list the biggest unmet needs, the pathogens, and then allow you all to add new pathogens.
Yes.
I think in the question and answer period, the concern was removal and flooding of the market with ones that aren't needed. We have concerns about that, and let me address the concerns. You know, the intent is not obviously to try to remove folks. First of all, we think there's really not a market unless there's something that really happens bad. So our concern is someone developing an antibiotic to meet a specific pathogen that's on the list, and then all of a sudden they get pulled off the list. Now what incentive would that be for anyone, really anyone, to go in and try to take advantage of this process?
Well, I would say that the FDA has various processes such as orphan drug designation and other designation processes now that we operate. And generally you have the simpler the rules, the easier these are to operate administratively. I believe that we also have a process that was established under the User Fee Act, the User Fee Agreement.
Yeah, and I was real involved with the orphan drug provision. So, but really, the question still is if there will be a debate. Sounds like from on both sides of the ability to remove. I think our basic analysis is one, there's no need to remove. Mm-hmm. Two, it's really a disincentive, mm-hmm. And I would ask to look at that provision from the folks who want to innovate, those who may have already spent a lot of money, and then all of a sudden it's off the list. Mm-hmm. So let me go to my other questions. As Dr. Frieden of the CDC testified in 2010, antibiotic resistance is a public health problem of increasing magnitude, and finding effective solutions to address this problem is a critical focus of the CDC activities. Is it safe to say that you feel similarly that finding solutions addressing this problem is a critical focus of your activities?
Yes.
And how important is new drug development in the fight against this public health threat?
It's crucial.
Okay, thank you. It kind of ties into this whole, obviously, the GAIN Act and what we're focused on today. Part of it we're focused on today. One of the issues is on the ventilator-assisted pneumonia example, where our rules are that if you they can't be tested if the population has already been received antibiotics. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this testing occurs overseas, and then, as I've stated numerous times, there's a concern with that because you're there, you're testing, you're spending money, you may segue into the EU system, and then we may lose that population. How do we get around, or is that exclusion of testing a population that has never received antibiotics, is that really a hurdle that we can't overcome in our testing aspects here in the United States?
We are currently in discussions both with the industry and the Infectious Disease Society of America and other interested parties about what the drug development paradigm should be for multi-drug resistant organisms. And we actually feel that a much abbreviated development program, a very small development program, which would be an incentive for developing these types of antibiotics, would be highly feasible if, in fact, it were linked to the concept of good antibiotic stewardship post-market.
So there's hope.
Absolutely, but I think that's something that we need to discuss more as far as the good antibiotic stewardship aspect of this.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the ranking member emeritus, Mr. Dingle, for 5 minutes for questions.
For your courtesy. Dr. Woodcock, welcome.
Thank you.
One way to address the threats in a supply chain is to know who is responsible for the pharmaceutical product at each point in the supply chain. I'm sure you agree with that, yes or no?
Yes.
As you know, the PDSA proposal would provide for lot-level traceability. Could lot-level traceability be helpful in identifying where in the supply chain a violation occurred?
It might be difficult due to the size of lots.
Okay, but you would be better off than you are now.
I think the benefits of doing that would have to be balanced against the costs of even enacting such a system.
Now, some have advocated for unit-level traceability over lot level, so that you can track individual products and identify threats before incidents occur. Would unit-level traceability be helpful in the instance of contamination or entry of a counterfeit product? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, one concern I continue to have is contamination or diversion of prescription drugs by persons outside the supply chain. Would lot-level traceability help the FDA to identify the path of a contaminated product as it traveled through domestic distribution?
Only partially, and would have to be reconstructed, I think, after the fact.
Okay. What would be the obstacles or the difficulties there?
Because large numbers of any given lot are manufactured, then determining if some counterfeits of that lot were added at some point would be difficult unless you had real-time tracking and you kept account of each, the volume.
Now, in the instance of contamination or diversion, would lot numbers be helpful if a particular lot of drugs traveled through multiple distributors and reached multiple pharmacies?
It would be helpful in retrospectively determining perhaps the point of entry of the contaminated version, but it would not be helpful, I don't think, in real time.
Thank you. Now, I happen to believe that manufacturers, distributors, and dispensers should keep accurate and thorough records detailing who is buying and selling a drug throughout the distribution chain. I'm sure you agree with that.
I agree.
Would it be helpful to FDA to have each entity in the supply chain, manufacturers, wholesale distributors, dispensers, accountable for the authenticity of their product here?
Yes.
Now, again, I want to commend the industry for their work on the RX Tech proposal. Traceability is a vitally important tool in securing our drug supply and one I believe would complement the drug safety proposal that I've been pushing. I look forward to working with industry and my friends on the committee to ensure that traceability proposals move through this committee in a way that will best achieve the mutual goal of preventing counterfeit and contaminated products from entering our drug supply. Doctor, thank you for your presence.
Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Yields to Dr. Gingrich from Georgia for 5 minutes for question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Woodcock, thank you.
Morning, Chef.
The GAIN Act is squarely focused on serious bacterial pathogens with equally serious unmet medical need, including gram-negative bacteria, a specific one that was dubbed Iraqi-Bacter due to the propensity of infections among our wounded soldiers in Iraq. It's an increasing cause of hospital-acquired infections in intensive care units, leading to tens of billions of dollars in expenses, and it's increasingly resistant to numerous drugs, leading to a high number of fatalities. It can show up as pneumonias, complicated skin infections, tissue infections, and indeed even septicemia, which is better known in common parlance as bloodstream infections. Most worrisome, Doctor, the pipeline for novel therapies against something like Iraqi-Bacter is slim to virtually non-existent. Now, Dr. Fauci, the director of the CDC, testified before this committee in April of 2010 that our focus should be on infections derived from problematic pathogens, like this gram-negative bacteria, Iraqi-Bacter. Do you agree, Dr. Woodcock, do you agree with Dr. Fauci that encouraging drug development to combat infections that arise from gram-negative pathogens like Iraqi-Bacter is an appropriate role for Congress and the FDA?
Absolutely.
According to the website of the FDA, you have launched several initiatives to combat antibiotic resistance, including encouragement of the development of new drugs, vaccine, and improved tests for infectious diseases. Yet many public health organizations, patient groups, and drug companies have stated that greater incentives are needed if we hope to increase new antibiotic drug development. Do you believe that current FDA actions are enough to encourage the numbers of new antibiotics we need to meet the growing public health threat that antibiotic resistance poses?
No, clearly it's not enough.
So the provisions in the GAIN Act, very specifically, Dr. Woodcock, like increasing the period, the time of exclusivity from 10 to 15 years, and to be very specific in regard to the pharmaceutical community that are developing these new drugs and biologics. Do you agree that they need to know ahead of time that all of this cost and expense and innovation and research and development, that literally the rug is not going to be pulled out from under them by some indiscriminate decision after the fact that the FDA might make in regard to a list of pathogens that we already know are causing serious medical illnesses, no matter where they might strike, whether it's in the bloodstream or in the lungs causing pneumonia or in the skin causing things like necrotizing disease, which indeed can be deadly. So my question in regard to all of this is, don't you agree, or do you disagree, that being very specific about the pathogens and things like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and a lot of these gram-negative bacteria, Enterococcus, and things like that, these need to be designated on the front end, and of course the director of the FDA has the opportunity, or the secretary of HHS, to add additional things to the list. So comment on that for us.
Certainly. It is obvious, and we know from experience, that industry needs, because of the cost and the risk, very clear pathway to market. And that is a big incentive if that is very clear and laid out. So that's extremely important. I agree with that. As far as how to do this in this specific instance, I think we are more administratively looking at how administratively you would set such an incentive up. And because antibiotic resistance evolves rapidly, and this is a dynamic field, and actually many organisms are implicated in this, it would seem that in general for Congress to set up some more general criteria and then have FDA designate that way. We then we can make agreements with companies about the designation at the time they come and talk to us about their development program and what the pathway would be. So it just seems that stipulating in the statute certain things rather than what the criteria might be, maybe setting the criteria would be a better way to go.
Well, I think that you, Mr. Chairman, I realize I'm over time, but let me just conclude here. I think, Dr. Woodcock, I think you answered my question and my premise in the affirmative, and this is sort of what I think Mr. Shimkus was getting at in regard to the ability to add to, and you have that in the GAIN Act. You have that ability as things develop to be able to add to the list. But I think the list at the outset in the law should be very specific. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield.
Chair, thanks,
Thank
gentlemen.
you for your patience.
Recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just get to my questions, if I can find them. They are here, I'll find them. There we go, okay. Thank you. As I said in my opening statement, I'm interested in the balance between hurrying the drugs that we need to market and making sure that we protect safety. It seems to me that most of the claims about FDA's poor performance have, in fact, been disproved, and you described quite powerfully how effective FDA has been as using its current accelerated approved authorities. So it is surprising to me that we're still talking about the need for yet another accelerated approval pathway And I hope we can all agree that we have to be somewhat cautious in this area. At the very least, we need to ensure we don't force FDA into a position where its approval standards are lowered and the agency ends up forced to approve ineffective or unsafe drugs, which is in no one's interest. So let me just ask you this. Does the FDA have concerns about H.R. 4132, the FAST Act, for example, having the potential to lower the approval standards?
Well, we would look forward to working with Congress and the committee on any given language and providing technical assistance. We think it's important to not lower the standards for safety and efficacy and to be clear in the language, while we do support the idea of clarifying what can be used as the basis for accelerated approval.
And do you take into account the fact that people who are gravely ill are in fact willing to take more risks? And what's the mechanism for doing that, for separating out those individuals who in fact are willing to take some more risks?
Well, we always balance benefit and risk. Obviously, cancer drugs aren't as safe as headache drugs. And so we're taking that into account. The user fee program, the prescription drug user fee program that is before Congress now, will have, as part of it, a formal mechanism where we go out and solicit patient input into these trade-offs, especially for diseases that aren't well understood, and so that we can understand how much risk people are willing to take for a certain amount of benefit. And then after marketing, typically there's patient information, and we're moving toward getting uniform patient information in the United States so that when people get a prescription drug, they understand the benefits and the risks, and they can make that trade-off for themselves because individual values differ.
And do we make those, do we distinguish between people who are pretty desperate to try things as opposed to sort of for the general population? I mean, is there any flexibility in that way?
Well, what we typically do is have the drug is studied, and so you understand the magnitude of the benefit, and then all the risks are described, and then it is determined that the patient, between the patient and the physician, when that treatment decision is being considered, that they would discuss both the upsides and the downsides of the therapy so that patient can make an informed choice.
So the obligation then of the FDA is to just make sure that there's complete disclosure of the so let me ask you this. Do you need more authorities to speed new therapies to market?
No, we don't think that new authorities are needed. Perhaps some clarification might be useful, but no, we feel that we can get safe and effective drugs that more risk is tolerated for cancer, for life-threatening diseases, and so forth. We can get these therapies to the patients with an appropriate balance of benefit and risk.
Okay. Thank you. Unless someone wants my time, I yield back.
Chair thanks gentlelady. Recognized gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Murphy. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Woodcock. I always appreciate your testimony and found you to be a very trustworthy source, and thank you for your leadership. I want to ask you about drug shortages. In particular, from what I understand, many of these are cancer drugs. Could you explain why we're facing shortages in cancer drugs?
I think the HHS Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation report has the best explanation of what happened. Most of these cancer drugs are off-patent sterile injectable drugs, and there were very few manufacturers in the United States making them, sometimes only one manufacturer. They were making a large list of sterile injectables also. And they developed some manufacturing problems. Multiple manufacturers developed problems making the drugs and had to shut down their lines or interrupt production. And this, as I said last time, was a perfect storm where this all sort of came together. Multiple manufacturers of the few that existed in the United States for sterile injectables all developed problems. As the report shows, many manufacturers had added newer injectable drugs that probably had increased profit margins as they came off patent, added them to their list, and so they were producing a very extensive list of products. And when they ceased production or had to restrict their production, then there were no other places to turn in the United States.
Is the FDA taking any steps to change some of these things, address the shortage issue?
Yes, the steps we take, number one, we work with the manufacturers. We do everything we can to keep these particular shortage drugs in production. We've even gone to the lengths of testing the drugs, see if the particles could be filtered out and allowing them to be shipped to the patients, to the doctors, if they would filter them at the time of use. Okay, that isn't what you'd want of a drug supply, but it's better than not having those drugs available. We also expedite any applications for making additional sites or additional manufacturers who want to make these drugs. We expedite their generic drug applications. If we have to, we work with foreign suppliers who may be making these drugs and see if they can ramp up their production and import temporarily into the United States to cover the shortage situation. We have some of that happening right now.
Let me ask another area. I'm a psychologist by training and worked in pediatrics, also serve in the Navy and work with PTSD and TBI veterans. And one of my concerns is also the abuse of drugs. It's a sad story that we have to address. And of course, the abuse of drugs also is associated with some shortages. Some of the stimulant medications used for attention disorder, for example, is in shortages. That hurts those who really need them, but there's also people using them that shouldn't be having them. And other class 2 and 3 drugs that are being abused too. And I wonder about addressing these as other issues of taking care of the shortages by doing such things on a federal level. An issue I'm working on writing legislation, much like a couple of states have done, and that is requiring a photo ID when people pick up some of these drugs. It's not difficult, and it's not a secret, that someone could take a Medicare patient's prescription, take it to the drugstore, fill it for Vicodin or something else, and next you see grandpa can't find his prescription, the doctor writes another one, and these things go on. Similar for abuse of some of the drugs used by children, which they may sell or they may redistribute. And I get particularly concerned when we have so many veterans who end up with their struggles, self-medicating themselves out of their pain. So I wondered if this is something that, in terms of states, I think Maine and North Carolina have put in some laws, in effect, requiring a photo ID or a designated person to pick up the drug when that person can't do it. If you know of any research in terms of, is this addressing some of the issues with regard to reduction of abuse, or at least helping a situation where drugstores, pharmacists are not put in the middle of basically becoming suppliers to drug abuse networks? Could you address that?
Thank you. We are doing quite a bit in this area. The administration last year announced an initiative to try to combat the epidemic of prescription drug abuse in the United States, and we have multiple efforts that we're working on. I'm not familiar with the results of the research on photo ID and what impact that might have on decreasing diversion to people who are not supposed to get the prescriptions. But it's clear that we need to take additional measures to control this epidemic. It is ravaging some communities.
I appreciate that. I'm aware, I believe one chain, CVS, requires on their own a photo ID, contacting the physician, asking for the diagnosis to verify a number of these steps in that process, and that helps. And I certainly know when I've talked to some pharmacists, and they languish with this idea that say, someone shows up with a prescription, we're filling it,
Right.
but worry that it's actually being abused. So I would love to be able to work with you more in addressing this, and I do appreciate your dedication to this. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Chair thanks gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes for questions.
Hey, Dr. Woodcock, how are you?
Thank you. I'm fine, thanks.
I have concerns about online pharmacies. As I gather, they're unregulated. It's kind of a wild west out there, and lots of issues associated with them. The latest article in the Wall Street Journal, of course, is an online pharmacy. Now, and we've heard testimony recently about abuse potential drugs and the problems of prescription drug abuse. So both adulterated and abuse potential. Can you comment on the role of online pharmacies in these two issues?
It's clear that online pharmacies can be.
By the way, just to be clear, there are legitimate and illegitimate online pharmacies. So I'm sorry, continue.
No, I agree with that. There are obviously sites around the world that can pose as pharmacies and are distributors and may introduce improper drugs or provide drugs without a prescription, or sometimes provide drugs that are counterfeit to people. The VIPS program, which certifies certain internet pharmacies as appropriate and has criteria, is one guide to consumers. We have educational material that we have tried to put out and, tried to educate patients and consumers on what proper procedures might be for ordering drugs over the internet, because unguided, they may well run into harm.
Now, is it fair to say, though, that, now, first, I'm a physician who happens to be a congressman who's married to a doctor. And I had never heard of the FIPS program until today, which is not a criticism of FDA. It's frankly a criticism of my wife. Just kidding. Just if you're watching on the internet, dear, I'm just teasing. It's my fault. But that say, is it fair to say that the current mechanism has some inadequacy, if even someone who theoretically would be educated, such as I, does not know?
I think it's a very difficult problem. The whole system was set up for brick and mortar pharmacies. Our whole control system was set up that way. Now we have the internet. As you said, it's the Wild West, and definitely it's putting American patients and consumers in harm's way.
I'm struck that as we speak about unit level tracking, really that doesn't mean anything if I'm buying online from something which I think is legitimate but which is illegitimate, and I'm getting an adulterated drug from another country. Is that a fair statement too?
Absolutely.
So until we can actually do something about the online pharmacies, we're going to continue to have a leaky bucket allowing things to come in which should not.
That's correct.
Any sense of how much of the drugs that are abuse potential being used here would come in through online pharmacies? Do we have a sense of the scope of the issue?
Do not. It's
And do we have a
difficult.
sense of how many of the online pharmacies are legitimate versus illegitimate?
And again, the internet is a very rapidly changing and evolving.
Fair answer. Now, let me ask you again, I'm aware of the issue of valid prescriptions versus invalid, and would just like your comments upon that.
Well, I think definition of a valid prescription is an important, keystone of any efforts, and we have to do that in light of now the electronic prescribing and phone prescribing and so forth, but I think that is a very important component.
So the valid prescription, just for those who may not be familiar with it, would be one it currently pertains to a controlled substance, but not to an uncontrolled substance. So I can get an antihypertensive, which doesn't require a valid prescription, but the Vicodin I would. But the absence of the requirement of a valid prescription for the antihypertensive may mean I get a adulterated drug. Fair statement?
Yes, if you happen to order from an inappropriate pharmacy on the internet.
So ideally, we would come up with we apply the definition of valid prescription. I'm just saying this, but to see if you would agree. The definition of a valid prescription, which would apply both to controlled and non-controlled substances?
I think, yes.
Okay. I know we're about to vote, and so I yield back to other members. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I respectfully request that my opening statement be placed in the record.
Without objection, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on questioning from Congressman Pallone regarding medical gases, and I know that you're working on this issue. As I understand it, the 6 medical gases that make up 99% of the prescriptions in the United States, oxygen, nitrogen, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, helium, and medical air are mostly derived from the air that we breathe. The FDA has a long history of using its enforcement discretion and exempting medical gases from its new drug application process. But recent changes to federal policy, I believe, has left both manufacturers and patients uncertain of the future of FDA-approved medical gases. The legislation that Congressman Pallone referenced, legislation I've introduced, the Medical Gas Safety Act, which is bipartisan in nature. I have introduced it with my colleague, Congressman Murphy. Chris Murphy, tries to address this situation in a bipartisan capacity. I want to work with you in this regard. Can you comment on where you might be going regarding this issue?
Certainly. We feel also that there are long recognized and medically acceptable uses of these traditional medical gases, and that some designation would be very useful, rather than having an application process
Yes.
to prove something that we already know.
Yes.
All right. So, but as far as some of the other issues relating to manufacturing process and so forth, we believe that our regulations are sufficiently flexible that we can work out an approach without additional legislation that would be mutually satisfactory to the industry and to the FDA.
Thank you, Doctor. I know that your staff has some reservations about developing separate current good manufacturing practice regulations for the medical gases. Codifying current regulatory experience with medical gases is, in my judgment, the best way to resolve some of the confusion. And the Compressed Gas Association, which is the safety standard-setting organization for the industry, has offered its full resources to assist in the rulemaking process. I want to thank you for your willingness to meet and work with the association, with the staff here on this committee, with my staff on this issue. I do not necessarily think that guidance can remove, I think guidance cannot remove the requirements from existing regulations. So I do think that some changes in the regulations are necessary, and I respectfully request that we continue to work together on this issue as PDUFA is reauthorized.
We'll be happy to work with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my
Chair,
time.
thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Woodcock, thanks for being with us today. If I could just kind of go back to a question that was asked by Dr. Burgess and one also that was asked by Dr. Murphy. One of the questions that Dr. Burgess asked, I want to make sure that I wrote it down correctly when he said it, that he had asked what can the FDA do to help incentivize businesses to stay in business in the manufacturing process. And your answer was at the time that your focus is really on that reliability. And Dr. Murphy then had asked a question in the same vein, because there's a lot of questions out there about on the drug shortages, that the question is to manufacturing problems, and that you had stated that that you wanted to, you'd help in trying to address that problem. You'd work with the manufacturer. Is there a difference between trying to keep people in business and those companies out there that are manufacturing right now?
Can you rephrase the question?
Well, the first part of the question is that you had said that, as Dr. Burgess had asked the question, he'd asked, what can the FDA do to help incentivize businesses to stay in the manufacturing process of producing the product? And you had said that in response to his question, that your only focus is really on the reliability end and not on trying to keep them in business. So that'd be a company out there that that might be trying to incentivize somebody to stay in that type of a process in manufacturing. But Dr. Murphy had asked the question as to if there are manufacturing problems in keeping pills out there or other drugs in the manufacturing stream to get to the patients, and that you would say that you would work with those manufacturers. And I'm just trying to figure out what the difference between the two is on the reliability and working with them. My
understanding of Dr. Burgess's question was, did we help with the economic incentives? And we don't have really any role in the economic aspects of drug production and marketing and so forth. We do work with manufacturers to try to keep them manufacturing shortage drugs or any other drugs, and we try to work with manufacturers to keep them manufacturing a reliable supply of the medicines that they produce. I do believe that the generic drug proposal that is before Congress right now will help with this because it will help us clear out our backlog of generic drug applications that have decreased the predictability of the generic drug review process, and hopefully we may encourage more entrants into that process. So we do work with them, but we are not involved in the marketing and the reimbursement or any of those aspects.
And also, in answering some of Dr. Murphy's questions, could you define when you say you'd help filter?
Yes. Manufacturers of sterile products, that would be that go into your vein, all right, we're finding they had particles in their products. That's bad, all right, that's very bad because they can go into your lungs and get stuck and so forth, so it's not acceptable. So when those were in shortage, rather than say you can't send them out, we tested them to make sure that a filter would take out the particles and not take out the drug. All right, and then we let the drugs be shipped with a filter so that at the point of delivery they could be filtered and get the particles out, and the patient would still get that drug rather than have it be in shortage. So I think that's an illustration that we try to work with the manufacturers to keep these drugs out there.
And also, other countries that are out there that have experienced drug shortages, how have they met the shortages, like, let's say, in Europe?
Yeah, they work much the same way that we do, and we work with the European regulatory authorities to try and make sure the international drug supply remains robust. So they take the same sorts of actions we do.
Okay, and just one last follow-up or question, if I may. With the 1918 flu pandemic that might have killed between 20 to 75 million individuals, it's being pretty much attributed now to not to the flu but to tuberculosis. And in January of this year, a completely 100% drug-resistant form of TB was identified in India that would not be treatable with any known antibiotic. What is the FDA doing right now to try to prevent that from getting to these shores?
Yes, well, we certainly are working with a coalition that's working on developing new drugs for multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. This is a serious threat. We recognize it, and we are doing everything we can. Our combination investigational drug guidance, which I realize is very technical, but that we put out that showed how you could develop several investigational drugs together to deal with a threat such as this, I think is helpful in this effort. And as I said earlier, we believe that if provisions for good antibiotic stewardship were able to be instituted, and we were sure that such a drug would only be used for a regimen only for drug-resistant tuberculosis, we could have a very small development program that would allow that drug to get on the market. That would provide, I think, a tremendous incentive to manufacturers to get into this space and develop drugs for multi-drug resistant TB.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. That concludes the questions you have. Go ahead, Dr. Cassidy, for one follow-up.
Mr. Lance brought up HR 2227, medical gas. Just to confirm that this would not apply to already approved substances, correct?
Correct.
They would continue to be regulated as they currently are.
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock, for appearing for the subcommittee this morning. We really appreciate your testimony and answering all of our questions. That concludes panel one. We'll now call panel two to the witness table. And I'd like to thank all of these witnesses for agreeing to testify before the subcommittee today. I'd like to quickly introduce our expert panel. First of all, Dr. John Maraganore is CEO of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Jeff Allen is the Executive Director of Friends of Cancer Research. Dr. Barry Eisenstein is a Senior Vice President of Science Affairs at Cubis Pharmaceuticals. Dr. John Powers is the Assistant Clinical Professor of Medicine at GW School of Medicine. And Mr. Michael Walsh is the President of Life Gas. Mr. Walsh is appearing on behalf of the Compressed Gas Association. Again, we thank all of you for coming this morning. We have your prepared statements. Dr. Maraganore, we'll begin with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Upton and Pitts and Ranking Members Waxman and Pallone. It is my privilege to provide testimony before the subcommittee today. My name is John Maraganore, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. As a scientist and a businessman, I have over 25 years of experience in biopharmaceutical research and development, serve on the board of several biotechnology companies, and I'm also an advisor to Third Rock Ventures and a member of the Biotech Industry Organization Governing Board. Founded in 2002, Alnylam is a small, non-profitable biotechnology company located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We are developing new medicines based on the science of RNA interference, or RNAi, which is a major breakthrough in biology that was recognized by the award of the 2006 Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology. Today, our company has 120 employees who are working on a pipeline of innovative medicines that could truly be transformative in the lives of patients afflicted with a number of genetic diseases, including diseases such as systemic amyloidosis, hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, severe hypercholesterolemia, Huntington's disease, liver cancer, and also respiratory syncytial virus. If we're successful in our efforts, we can create a whole new class of medicines and treat disease in a fundamentally different way. I'm here today to discuss the importance and the benefits of Congressman Stearns's and Towns's Faster Access to Specialized Therapies, or the FAST bill, which would modernize the accelerated approval pathway at the Food and Drug Administration. The accelerated approval pathway, implemented in 1992 by the FDA and codified by the Congress in 1997, has indeed been a great success story, but only in part. While its applicability has been largely limited to certain disease areas, mainly cancer and HIV/AIDS, and certain situations, the pathway has stimulated an explosion of investment in innovation in those diseases and has brought immense benefit to patients suffering from those diseases. There are several reasons why the accelerated approval pathway should be expanded and, in fact, modernized. First, as I just mentioned, the accelerated approval pathway has worked, but only in part. That is, it's been largely limited in practice to drugs that treat cancer and HIV/AIDS, along with a handful of other situations. While this is great news for patients afflicted with cancer and HIV/AIDS, it's not good news for patients suffering from other serious and life-threatening diseases. Nothing in the words of the current statute limit the accelerated approvals pathway to just oncology and HIV/AIDS. In fact, the statute is worded broadly. But the current FDA practice leaves many other treatments for rare and serious conditions effectively excluded from the pathway. We need to end the uncertainty about how the FDA can apply accelerated approval in the future by ensuring that the pathway is available for all therapies which treat serious or life-threatening conditions by enacting the FAST Act. Second, it is important that the ability to utilize the accelerated approval pathway is both better understood by sponsors and more consistently applied by the FDA. This is especially true when it comes to FDA accepting clinical endpoints, including those that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity or mortality, to demonstrate a reasonable likelihood of overall clinical benefit. While the pathway allows for approval based upon effects on clinical endpoints that are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, in practice, the lack of clarity surrounding such approval options has led to a very limited use of accelerated approval by sponsors and the FDA. Third, it is time to have an expanded and modernized accelerated approval pathway that incorporates the remarkable advances in the life sciences that have and will provide an unprecedented understanding of the underlying biological mechanisms and disease pathogenesis. These advances can enable novel drug development strategies that employ leading-edge methodologies and tools such as biomarkers and novel clinical trial designs that can overall improve how we implement accelerated approval. The FAST bill would achieve all of these objectives described above by expressing the sense of Congress that the FDA should utilize the accelerated approval pathway as fully, as frequently as possible, while maintaining, very importantly, FDA's safety and effectiveness standards. And by codifying, modernizing, and expanding FDA's accelerated approval pathway with 4 targeted revisions. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I urge Congress to consider the FAST Act.
Chair, thanks you, gentlemen. We're presently voting on the floor. We're going to try to get through a couple more of you. Dr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Jeff Allen, Executive Director of Friends of Cancer Research, a think tank and advocacy organization based here in Washington. I'd like to thank the staff of the committee who have worked very hard in putting together this important hearing. It's an honor to be here today. While compelling progress continues to be made within the field of oncology, there is much more to be done. This year, cancer will claim the lives of over 570,000 Americans. This, Mr. Chairman, is roughly equivalent to every citizen in your home county of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. With such a profound toll, improved ways to combat cancer and other diseases are desperately needed. While there are many factors that make development of new drugs complex, assessments of the process often focus on the FDA. Critics have frequently portrayed the FDA as slow and inefficient compared to other countries. However, our research reveals that FDA is approving anti-cancer drugs in a more timely fashion than the European counterpart. In fact, since 2003, FDA has approved 42 new cancer medicines versus just 32 by the EMA. Of the 28 common approvals, all were available to U.S. patients first. A cornerstone of the FDA standard for approvals was established in 1962 by Congress, requiring that all new drugs demonstrate not only their safety, but also efficacy. Without this requirement, American patients would have continued to have been given medicines that actually provided no improvement to their health. As this committee seeks to optimize and improve FDA practices and maintain its standing as the global leader, the requirement that new drugs demonstrate both safety and efficacy must be upheld. While the need for new treatments is immense and the challenge is significant, the solution is not to arbitrarily lower this important standard that has been in place for 50 years. In 1992, as science progressed, and in acknowledgement of an increased public health need, regulations were developed to establish the accelerated approval mechanism. This has shown to be an important tool used by the FDA to uphold the rigorous scientific standards while facilitating timely access to life-saving treatments. For example, in oncology, accelerated approval has been used for over a third of new cancer drug approvals since 1999. However, since 2007, the number of oncology drugs approved through this mechanism has decreased. In order to optimize the use of this tool, Congress should take action to enhance accelerated approval to ensure that it is applied consistently, efficiently, and effectively. This is not to suggest in any way that the standards of safety and efficacy should be altered, but rather to examine additional opportunities in which accelerated approval is the optimal approach. Today, much like at important times throughout recent history, the FDA needs an updated mechanism to respond to the rapid advancement of science. With the expansion of knowledge about the biological basis of complex disease, new targeted therapies are being developed. For these new treatments that show remarkable benefit early in development, the traditional approach may not be appropriate. Currently, there are no clear guidelines to expedite subsequent studies that would generate the needed evidence and minimize the number of patients who would need to be assigned to the current standard of care. In order to address this, Congress should establish a mechanism that would allow the FDA to designate a new compound that shows substantial clinical activity in early phase trials as a breakthrough product. Upon designation, the sponsor, working closely with FDA, would develop trial designs to abbreviate or combine traditional phases of development. This would avoid giving larger numbers of patients a potentially harmful or ineffective drug as part of a control arm, while maintaining current safety and efficacy standards. The establishment of this new designation would help FDA respond to highly innovative new medicines quickly and consistently across the agency, as well as to communicate and encourage drug developers to pursue trial designs that are able to show potential benefit earlier in development. I conclude my remarks today by reiterating that rigorous FDA standards cannot be compromised. The FDA should be given the ability to respond to cutting-edge science and the most promising therapies through an enhanced accelerated approval mechanism, and a breakthrough product designation. I thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. The ranking member and I have consulted. The last time we did this, we missed a vote. So we'd better break at this point. We'll recess and come back to the panel as soon as the last vote of the series is over. Chair, the subcommittee stands recess. Time of our recess having expired, we'll reconvene. And Chair recognizes Dr. Eisenstein for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the urgent need to spur greater innovation and accelerate the development of new antibiotics to combat the threat of drug-resistant pathogens. I am Dr. Barry Eisenstein, Senior Vice President of Scientific Affairs at Cubist Pharmaceuticals, a company focused on the research and commercialization of antibiotics. Headquartered in Lexington, Massachusetts, we currently market Cubicin, a first-line intravenous antibiotic for the treatment of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, better known as MRSA. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of patients and healthcare experts alike, I wish to commend this subcommittee for holding this hearing and for the leadership of Congressman Gingrey and Green and others for the introduction of the Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now, or GAIN Act, of 2011. The bipartisan GAIN Act would directly promote the research and commercialization of new drugs and diagnostics against resistant pathogens. It offers our best hope to stimulate American innovation, particularly within small and mid-market companies, and strengthen the hand of clinicians and scientists in the fight against drug-resistant pathogens both here and abroad. Annually, at least 1.7 million Americans acquire a bacterial infection in the hospital, and nearly 100,000 of them die. And we have heard the heartbreaking stories. A young high school football player loses his life to a battle with MRSA. The woman who just had mastectomy surgery acquires a resistant post-op infection and goes into kidney failure. ICU patients in American hospitals and our troops in the Middle East alike are suffering untreatable Acinetobacter infections at alarming rates, referred to earlier as Iraqibacter. 2 years ago, the U.S. Air Force testified on the challenging epidemic of multi-drug resistant infections that has resulted in a shortage of safe and effective antibiotics. Just as antimicrobial resistance is rising, we are faced with a disturbing and dangerous lack of new antibiotic drugs, particularly against gram-negative bacteria. The Pew Charitable Trust warns us that the antibiotic pipeline is dwindling and a global crisis looms. This threatens much of modern medicine because antibiotics are crucial from surgical recovery to cancer treatment, As Dr. William Evans, the CEO of St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital noted, quote, "We don't want to find ourselves in a situation in which we have been able to save a child's life after cancer diagnosis, only to lose them to an untreatable multi-drug resistant infection." The antibiotic pipeline is running dry because antibiotics uniquely are wasting assets. Bacteria evolve so quickly that the development of resistance is inevitable. Thus, each new antibiotic has only a finite lifespan. Appropriate stewardship is an important component of antibiotic use. That said, by itself doesn't increase the supply of new compounds. Because antibiotics are used for acute conditions and for a short period, much of the biopharmaceutical industry does not invest in antimicrobial development and has instead turned its efforts to products aimed at more chronic diseases. The GAIN Act is targeted at precisely this problem. By building on current law and extending the new drug exclusivities created by the 1984 Hatch-Waxman amendments only for urgently needed antibiotics, it would dramatically improve the prospects for attracting new investments for the development and approval of new antibiotics so needed by our patients. The Act would send a powerful signal to scientists and investors exploring new molecules and forming new companies, as well as to large established biopharmaceutical companies, that Congress recognizes the unique challenge in this area and is opening the door to new innovation, new investigations, and greater investor interest. The enhanced exclusivity for antibiotics, as well as the straightforward designation of qualified infectious disease products, is based on what Dr. Janet Woodcock of the FDA recently described as the wildly successful Orphan Drug Act. Mr. Chairman, this committee has a unique opportunity to take timely action against a serious public health threat. The market failure that has drained our pipeline of important new antibiotics remains. I urge the members of this subcommittee to move the GAIN Act through committee and enact it into law during this 112th Congress. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenstein. Dr. Powers, you're recognized for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Good afternoon. Hi, today. My name is John Powers, and I'm a practicing infectious disease and internal medicine physician and a medical researcher who actively cares for patients. I was a scientist at FDA for almost a decade, and while there, I was one of the co-chairs of the Interagency Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance. I would like to share with you today my perspectives as a clinician, researcher, and having been a patient myself on appropriately developing incentives for antibiotics where there is the greatest need. My remarks are my own views, and I am not representing any agency or organization, but I am here speaking on behalf of the patients for whom I care. Several patient and consumer and public health groups have expressed the same views as I will present here today. Government intervention is needed to spur antibiotic development because antibiotics are less profitable for drug companies than other therapeutic areas, resulting in decreased investment. The Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now, or GAIN bill, provides those incentives to develop new antibiotics. In any policymaking, as in science, one must first outline the problem, then come up with potential solutions while minimizing unintended consequences, implement that policy, and then measure whether it has its intended effects. The problem of serious diseases for which there are no effective therapies has been well outlined. The question now is how best can GAIN address these problems? If the public is to make an investment on new antibiotics, the public should get something of measurable value in return while not worsening the problem of antibiotic resistance. Several changes to GAIN might help it focus to best address public health needs while limiting potential adverse consequences. First, GAIN should focus on patients and their diseases rather than organisms. I have never had a patient tell me their E. coli hurts or that their Klebsiella is killing them. Patients present with disease syndromes like pneumonia, and I have certainly heard enough people in this room coughing today to show that symptoms are a problem. The human body contains more bacterial than human DNA, and organisms do not cause problems for patients until they cause disease. In fact, the word pathogen implies pathology and disease. Any list of organisms in the bill would be quickly outdated and hard for FDA to implement. In addition, FDA regulations appropriately point out that drugs are approved for recognized diseases or conditions, and organisms are neither. Use of antibiotics to eliminate organisms in the absence of disease would paradoxically increase antibiotic resistance. Second, GAIN should focus on the treatment of serious and life-threatening diseases where lack of safe and effective therapies results in death or serious disability. Antibiotic resistance in the test tube has little effect on patients who would recover without antibiotics, but it is inappropriate use in these settings that has worsened antibiotic resistance. Despite efforts by CDC, FDA, and others, a substantial portion of antibiotic prescriptions are still not warranted, provide no benefits to patients, and cause the problem of antibiotic resistance we are trying to control. Third, there should be valid scientific evidence based on FDA's standard of substantial evidence from adequate and well-controlled trials that these drugs actually meet unmet medical needs. In a 1979 landmark Supreme Court case, Thurgood Marshall pointed out that people with terminal diseases should not receive less protection under the law from unsafe and ineffective drugs than persons with curable diseases. Test tube and animal studies are helpful in choosing drugs to study in people, but people are not rodents. The complexity of the human body is totally humbling. 3/4 of antibiotics submitted to FDA for review with promising test tube and animal studies ultimately fail to show safety and efficacy in human disease. Approving antibiotics today, hoping for some future promise, makes no sense as resistance is inevitable with all antibiotics, sometimes occurring before the drug is even marketed. There is no guarantee that a drug approved today will address resistance tomorrow. In a study from Boston, almost half of antibiotics approved since 1980 have disappeared from the market, either because of safety and efficacy issues or because of poor sales because they did not address public health needs. Therefore, numbers of drugs approved is not a measure of public health benefits. Fourth, we need new tools to evaluate antibiotics that will make trials more efficient and less expensive for companies to perform. Determining who needs and who does not need antibiotics and developing better outcome measures to evaluate directly how patients feel and function are urgently needed so we can get the valid evidence we need to know if the drugs actually meet unmet medical needs. Fifth and finally, any incentives should go hand in hand with programs for appropriate stewardship of antibiotics. For any scarce resource, conservation should accompany increased production. Unfortunately, we as physicians have been only moderately successful at policing ourselves to appropriately use antibiotics, but greater efforts are underway. FDA should be given the authority to develop strategies to evaluate and ensure appropriate antibiotics where they are most needed and to minimize antibiotic resistance. An HHS-level internal group to address issues related to antibiotic resistance would help strengthen ongoing efforts of the interagency task force. Focusing the GAIN bill on the 5 ways I have just outlined will result in addressing the goals it sets out to achieve, developing new and safe antibiotics with an appropriate evidence base to positively affect patients' lives while simultaneously limiting antibiotic resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. Mr. Walsh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Mike Walsh. I'm president of Life Gas, which is part of Linde North America. We're headquartered in New Jersey, and we have about 4,500 employees in the United States. I'm here today to testify on behalf of the Compressed Gas Association, of which we are a member. CGA represents companies engaged in the manufacture and distribution of compressed gases, including medical gases. The Compressed Gas Association was founded in 1913 and currently has more than 120 member companies. CGA serves as a safety standard setting organization for the medical gas industry. The medical gas companies in our coalition employ about 21,000 employees and have around 4,500 locations, half of which are small businesses. I personally entered into this industry, the medical gas industry, as a small business owner. Linde and other members of the Compressed Gas Association provide medical gases that are used by doctors primarily for respiratory care. You can find our products in hospitals, clinics, doctors' offices, and in homes across the country. On behalf of the CGA, I want to offer my thanks to Congressman Leonard Lance and Chris Murphy for introducing the Medical Gas Safety Act. Your leadership role in this issue has been pivotal. I also want to thank Chairman Pitts and Ranking Member Pallone for your willingness to address these issues in the very important bill you're working on. Naturally, I also want to thank Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman of the full committee as well. Medical gases, like oxygen, are used by medical practitioners as prescription drugs every day. We have over 1 million patients using it in a variety of conditions. and medical oxygen has been used for more than a century. Medical gases were in use for decades before the FDA was created and the new drug application process was initiated. And here's the really key point. Medical gases have a long history of safe and effective use. The most common ones are derived from the air, things we're breathing today. These common medical gases are a unique class of drug products that are different from traditional pharmaceuticals in a lot of ways. We have different properties than pharmaceutical drugs. We have a different delivery method. We have a different manufacturing process. We have a different type of container that holds the product. Medical gas manufacturers make no medical claims for medical gases, which is very different for traditional prescription drugs. However, the FDA currently regulates medical gases with the same regulatory system as traditional pharmaceuticals. This has created significant and growing regulatory issues. These practical issues create uncertainty and drive up compliance costs for our industry. Medical gases need a separate regulatory system that takes into account these unique characteristics. Medical Gas Safety Act addresses a number of critical regulatory issues facing the medical gas industry. It establishes an appropriate approval process for medical gases. It requires the creation of a separate regulations for medical gases. It ensures that FDA fees do not disproportionately impact medical gas manufacturers, many of whom are small businesses. This legislation will create regulatory certainty for our industry. It will ensure that patients and the medical community have access to these life-saving products. It will remove current uncertainty regarding the federal regulations of medical gases for federal and state inspectors. The FDA has recognized the unique nature of medical gases for a very long time. Until now, the FDA has generally used its enforcement discretion, not to require medical gases to go through the new drug application process. Recently, the FDA began the Unapproved Drug Initiative, which is intended to eliminate all unapproved drugs from the marketplace, including medical gases. If the Unapproved Drug Initiative is applied to medical gases, this would remove access for patients to gases as simple as oxygen. Recent changes in enforcement policies related to the export of unapproved drugs have also created serious challenges for our industry. Also, the regulatory system in place for medical gases does not take into account the unique characteristics of medical gases. In response to concerns raised by the Compressed Gas Association, the FDA stated in 1976 in the preamble to the original Current Good Manufacturing Practices rulemaking that they intend to develop separate regulations for medical gases. No such regulations have been developed. This legislation will provide a clear, targeted regulatory structure for medical gases, creating a process for medical gases to become approved drugs and establishing specific regulations for medical gases, which will reduce uncertainty, improve compliance, and improve safety in what is already a very safe industry. I applaud all of you again for your willingness to address these important and long-standing regulatory issues. Thanks again on behalf of the FDA for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Chair thanks the panel for being patient, waiting while the members voted. We'll now begin questioning, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Maraganore, in your testimony, you cite the success of FDA's accelerated approval pathway for HIV and AIDS and cancer treatments, but indicate the accelerated approval framework has done little to help expedite treatments for rare diseases. Can you elaborate on why the accelerated pathway has not led to gains in the rare disease space that you would all like to see?
Yes, I think it really speaks back to the comments that Dr. Woodcock made in terms of the clarity around the utility and the usefulness of the accelerated approval process for diseases outside of cancer and HIV/AIDS. And clearly what I think is being proposed in Congressman Stearns and Towns' proposal is a way of significantly enhancing and modernizing our understanding of accelerated approval to the point where it will be used more frequently, I would expect, for the purposes of rare orphan diseases where there's significant unmet medical need and certainly an important desire, I think, for patients and physicians to have access to medicines faster.
Now, some experts believe that FDA is seeking to limit the use of accelerated approval for cancer drugs. Is this the case? Rather than narrowing the use of accelerated approval in cancer, shouldn't we be looking for ways to expand it? And what should Congress do to prevent FDA from limiting its use?
I think there's been some concern around potential changes within the FDA's views on how accelerated approval would be used in cancer based on some hearings that were held about this time last year. Clearly the FDA has used this approach for cancer-based medicines. We believe that the FDA will continue to do so. I think our desire is to really see it expanded and clarified as a system while maintaining, very importantly, maintaining the safety and efficacy standards that exist today for the approval of medicines.
And how would the FAST Act incentivize research and development of innovative therapies and treatments for serious diseases?
Well, clearly the ability of having a clear and established framework whereby medicines in the context of very serious unmet medical needs can be approved through an accelerated approval pathway would certainly encourage the investment that's needed to ultimately bring these types of products to the marketplace. Clearly, innovative medicines are increasingly being discovered by young companies like ours, of which there are many in this country, in a very vibrant industry. But this industry has been challenged by the increasing time it takes to get drugs to the marketplace and the increasing costs. And accelerated approval in the context of very serious unmet medical needs would provide a framework for getting drugs to patients faster in a way that would be more acceptable to the investors that have to put capital at risk to ultimately bring these products to market.
Thank you. Dr. Eisenstein, while the threat of antibiotic drug resistance is a looming public health crisis, the drug development pipeline has not kept pace with this threat. What can we do to turn this around?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. I believe that the GAIN Act, as presently formulated, provides us with precisely the right tools to provide the incentives needed. To cite Dr. Woodcock's earlier testimony, quote, "We need economic incentives beyond the regulatory ones for these bad bugs. Industry needs a clear pathway to the market." I could not have said that better myself. And when one looks at the enormous success of the Orphan Drug Act that was enacted in 1983, the Office of the Inspector General, in reviewing that in 2001, declared, A, that it was extraordinarily successful in enabling, at the time, over 200 new drugs. We're now over 350 new drugs through the Orphan Drug Act. But I would say equally importantly, they pointed out that the increased market exclusivity was the most important determinant of the success of that program. So I believe we have everything we need in the GAIN Act as it's presently written.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Walsh, I understand that FDA regulation has caused problems for many in the medical gas business. Many of these are small businesses. Can you explain how and why FDA regulation has caused these problems?
Yes, I just want to share a little of a personal story. Thank you, because I was one of those small business owners, and when I had started this business, we were under the guidelines of a grandfathered product, and if I would have known today what I've known back then, I would have not have started this business. We went on and created, through our employees, a great organization with nearly 1,000 of employees, but we are marketing, distributing, and selling an unapproved drug. And so you're asking to invest in that, and then the regulations, if we were enforced to go under a strict pharmaceutical standard, would be too expensive for the small companies to follow.
Okay, my time has expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Dr. Allen a question, and then I wanted to ask Dr. Powers a question. Let me start with Dr. Allen. I think we all agree that FDA needs to be able to be flexible in determining approval requirements, and we've heard from Dr. Woodcock in your testimony there's ample evidence that FDA does, in fact, use its authority in a flexible manner, and that's enabled FDA to get important drugs through the regulatory process in a timely manner, in some circumstances based on quite limited data. That being said, I recognize there can be advantages to clarifying and improving some of FDA's authorities to facilitate its use of accelerated approval pathways, and I think the pathway you propose for breakthrough therapies deserves serious consideration, as does the pathway put forward in the FAST Act by Representative Stearns and Towns and the special population limited use pathway proposed by IDSA in its submitted testimony. My main concern, Dr. Allen, is about any proposal to help speed new therapies to market is that it doesn't lower the safety or effectiveness standards by which FDA approves new medicines. Now, I know you mentioned that you don't want to, I think you actually said in your testimony, I don't want to lower the safety or effectiveness standards, but I just wanted you to basically expand on that a little. If you could, do you agree that whatever improvements we make, well, you've said that you don't think they should lower the safety and effectiveness standards, but just if you would spend a little time just, giving me some more information on that.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I absolutely agree that the current standards of safety and efficacy that have been in place for decades need to continue to be upheld, first and foremost. I think the difference in what we are proposing here through the idea of a breakthrough designation, it's important to distinguish that accelerated approval is an approval mechanism where the breakthrough is a designation or a process-oriented question. And what we're seeing, and I'm most familiar with oncology, of course, is that there are new drugs being developed that are highly targeted and being used in select populations where they achieve the greatest benefit and the lowest amount of toxicity. And in those cases, the traditional development plan of a phase 1 followed by a phase 2 followed by a phase 3 trial may not always be appropriate, and there may be ways to expedite that. And we've worked with several expert groups, including the National Cancer Institute, the FDA, the Brookings Institution, and others, to look at those strategies. And while it was mentioned that there may not need to be a new law here, I think that the 1.5 million Americans that will hear the words, "You have cancer" this year would appreciate looking at all policies that will help expedite promising new therapies to them quickly.
All right, well, thank you. Now, Dr. Powers, one of the things you alluded to is the issue of making sure that use of antibiotics is targeted to infections for which they're actually useful and making sure that the patients actually have those infections. One feature currently included in the GAIN Act is the availability of 6 months of additional exclusivity for an antibiotic if its manufacturer develops a companion diagnostic test to be used with a new antibiotic. I understand that in order to really accomplish the goal of directing new antibiotics to the right patients, the test would have to help identify where in the body an infection is, what kind of bacteria is causing it, and should suggest or ensure that the antibiotic in question is an appropriate treatment for the infection. Did I get that right? I mean, I'm just, can you tell me more about whether you think it's possible to develop tests that accomplish this and how to make sure that we're not giving additional incentives for tests that may not help us conserve precious antibiotics?
That's correct. I think it gets back to the issue of disease versus just harboring an organism in your body. So if we were to determine or develop diagnostics that merely tell you that you have an organism on your nose, that wouldn't help us if we then treat all those people when that treatment wouldn't help. On the other hand, if we specifically develop diagnostics to show that people have a disease, that would be more helpful. And through the current 510K process that FDA utilizes for medical devices, you don't necessarily need to show anything other than you can detect an organism. So we would need to go beyond that and actually have helpful information, not only for clinical trials so we can enroll the right people, but also those could be useful in practice as to who to direct antibiotics to and who not to treat.
But you think it's possible to develop tests that accomplish this, right?
I think the technology is there, and I think that's why it's helpful to develop incentives that would help people to do this.
Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I could ask, I know we gave this to you a little while ago, ask unanimous consent to include in the record the statement of the Infectious Diseases Society of America.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey, for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm going to start out with Dr. Eisenstein. I almost said Dr. Einstein after reading his resume, and I'm most impressed with that. Dr. Powers testified that almost half of antibiotics approved since 1980 have disappeared from the market, either because of safety and efficacy issues or because of poor sales because the drug did not address public health needs. This is a question, do you agree with Dr. Powers that current FDA oversight of antibiotics and the reality that market forces, such as poor sales, will help ensure generally that only those drugs that provide an unmet need will ultimately find their way to the market, or most importantly, be financial wins for the drug companies? Is that enough?
Well, I agree that a drug to be successful needs to demonstrate utility with patients. What the FDA process does is provide evidence of efficacy and safety. It doesn't, though, translate necessarily to effectiveness, which is what happens in the broad population. That said, with the enormity of medical need that we presently have, with the enumerated organisms plus others that I can talk about if you like, there's clearly a medical need and there's clearly a market failure in terms of being able to provide the appropriate incentives for companies to be able to make the investments in antimicrobials. And it appears that all of my colleagues on this committee are in complete agreement with that notion. That's, again, why I feel the GAIN Act as presently designated does provide exactly that sort of assistance.
Well, I thank you for that. And there's one part of Dr. Powers' testimony, and maybe he'll have time, Mr. Chairman, to respond to this as well, but I want to stay with Dr. Eisenstein for just a second. In regard to your comments in your testimony about the GAIN Act, the fact that we've been working on it for a number of years, it has wide bipartisan support, especially here on the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, and listing these pathogens, these known pathogens, and I referenced that in my opening remarks, whether it's MRSA or whether it's some gram-negative. We talked about the Iraqi-Bacter problem with the troops returning from Operation Iraqi Freedom and other conflicts. It's important, I think, and I think you pointed it out, that these are known pathogens. Now, Dr. Powers is suggesting that, that nobody comes in and says, oh, this Klebsiella is killing me, or I can't stand this Iraqi-Bacter. They say, well, I'm coughing and I think I may have pneumonia, or I've got this horrible skin infection and my skin is sloughing off, to make a case for, I guess, some change to this carefully worked on piece of legislation, the GAIN Act. And to me, it's almost, if I could make an analogy in the criminal justice system, to say that if you've got a known thief out there, that you don't make every effort to apprehend him or her, but rather to take all your law enforcement and your security measures and you pick 2 or 3 banks in the local neighborhood to protect, because those are the areas which he might strike next. I don't know if that's a great analogy, but I hope everybody understands the point that I'm trying to make. What say you about that? And then I'll go to Dr. Powers and let him comment on that.
It's absolutely true what Dr. Powers says, that bugs by themselves don't mean that one has disease. If I were to look around the room here, there may be, 50 or 80 folks in the room. Probably 20 of us have Staph aureus, and maybe 30 of us have Staph aureus in our noses right now. And that about a third of the people that walk in this room have staph in their noses all the time. And the other half of the 2/3 that are left, about half of those, have staph that come and go at various times. And we're seeing increasing numbers of those staph being MRSA staph. So perhaps 10 of us are walking around with MRSA staph in our noses right now. And yet, as an infectious disease physician, I wouldn't think about treating any of us for any of that. One has to have a condition, a disease, that says, I am an infection causing a problem for this patient, that goes along with certain manifestations. If it's pneumonia, the patient will have a cough, will have a shortness of breath, will have chest pain, will have fever. There are a constellation of methods that one can detect that. You're a physician as well. You understand that one makes the diagnosis based on what the patient shows, what the patient is saying, what your own examination of the patient shows. That said, if the patient appears to have a pneumonia and you're able to recover a pure culture of Staph aureus from the expectorated sputum, you know that the patient is suffering from staphylococcal pneumonia, and every hour that goes by that you don't treat that patient, the likelihood of the patient dying goes up significantly. And if we don't get drugs on board fast enough, we may lose 25 to 30% of even relatively healthy individuals.
To put it in really simple terms, and I know I'm beyond my time, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it, I will yield back, but it's like closing the barn door after the horse is long gone. So I thank you very much for that response, Dr. Powers. I apologize I didn't have time to go.
Dr. Powers, if you'd like to respond, you can.
Sure, I would. I mean, I understand what you're saying. To use your thief analogy, it would be sort of like saying, and first I want to say, I think everyone is very appreciative about gain because we absolutely need to do something about this. And I think the question that I tried to bring up in my testimony is, can we focus the bill so that we make sure that we do what we think we want to do without causing more harm? So I guess the concern is that, you know, if you see a bank robber and he's wearing a blue coat and the police say, we're going to go out and arrest everybody who's wearing a blue coat. And so the thing that Dr. Eisenstein brought up is these same organisms can cause less serious disease, and they can also cause more serious disease. And Mr. Green, all the diseases you listed when you spoke earlier to Dr. Woodcock, they're all serious ones. But FDA actually has approved 64 new drug applications for these same kinds of organisms for non-serious, non-life-threatening diseases since 1980. So that's why I think the history shows, and also those are the more profitable areas to go because those less severe infections are more common in patients. So I think that's the issue of trying to focus it to, we're all talking about serious and life-threatening diseases here. The question is, if that's what we're talking about, could we actually focus the bill to that?
All right. Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, Dr. Powers, let me pursue that issue with you. The GAIN Act seeks to create incentives that would prompt drug companies to develop and market new antibiotics. Specifically, it would give a 5 years additional exclusivity if a company gets a new antibiotic approved. If we're talking about giving such a generous reward to companies, I think we need to ensure that two things are in place at a minimum. First, we need to make sure that we're only providing exclusivity for the kinds of drugs that will truly benefit the public health. Only antibiotics that treat dangerous infections for which we do not already have effective treatments should be covered, in my opinion. As currently written, the bill would provide exclusivity for drugs if they are targeted to treat specified bacteria. Some, including you, have expressed concern that this kind of model is both inappropriate and unusual for the FDA, and have instead suggested we look at targeting drugs that treat specific infections instead of just bacterial species. More significantly, some believe that GAIN should be limited to new antibiotics for treating serious infections for which there is an unmet medical need. Can you explain a bit more about why focusing on specific infections is appropriate and why we should reserve incentives for drugs that treat serious infections with unmet medical need?
Again, I think the issue is that antibiotics can be used to treat a wide array of infections caused by the same exact organism. And I can give an example of when I worked at FDA, several companies came in asking for indications for pneumonia that was caused by multi-drug resistant organisms. Now that was completely appropriate. At the same time, they asked for approval for multi-drug resistant organisms for sinus infections and ear infections in kids and other things that predominantly get better on their own, sometimes even without antibiotics. So the history of what has happened before shows that, and in a sense, you can't blame a company for asking. FDA didn't grant those, though, because they applied the same exact standard that we're talking about today. it's not clear whether resistance in the test tube has much of an impact on patient outcomes in a disease where people will get better anyway. So it seems to make sense to focus on the areas of where, when you have a resistant disease, that's what's going to kill you. The other thing is that this sort of comports with everything that FDA has ever done in the past related to providing incentives. Priority review, accelerated approval that we're talking about today, and fast-track designation, as well as Subpart E approvals, all are based on serious and life-threatening diseases, unmet medical needs, and added benefit above available therapies. So it fits in with the regulatory paradigm already, which of course would make it easier to implement as well.
Well, the second thing I think needs to be in place is a robust stewardship program. We need to make sure that any antibiotics that are approved under this kind of new system are protected once they are on the market. We have seen far too many antibiotics lose their effectiveness because the bugs they seek to treat become resistant. And that's a problem caused in large part by overuse of these drugs. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen with these new antibiotics that we have all invested so much in, after all, when extended exclusivity is granted. We all pay higher drug prices for a longer period of time. Do you agree with that concept?
I think that's absolutely key, and they have to go hand in hand. To pass something about giving incentives to develop new drugs now, hoping that we will approve something about stewardship later, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. These really need to be linked to each other, because developing new drugs without the ability to use them in the appropriate places they need to be used is really a dangerous thing. That's kind of how we got to where we are today.
Can you elaborate more on what ideas you have about stewardship?
I think that I put a couple in my testimony in terms of how I think that allowing FDA to have the authority to designate where drugs should be used appropriately is a big step. In the past, FDA has had the authority to restrict drugs where they weren't safe and effective. Here we'd be saying that, well, maybe these drugs could be used in less life-threatening diseases, but we really think they ought to be reserved for these specific serious diseases. That would be novel. So I think giving FDA the authority to do that would be really important. The other thing is, having been on the interagency task force myself, I know somebody said to me once, you know, it's different when it's your 25th job at the bottom of your list of things to do versus you come into work every day and that's exactly what you have to focus on. So I think developing an HH-level internal group that consists of agencies that address this problem might highlight the issues associated with antibiotic resistance and allow people to spend their time focusing on it.
Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place in the record letters of support for the Medical Gas Safety Act from the Compressed Gas Association and 3 manufacturers: Air Products, Air Gas, and Tri-Gas.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Walsh, can you give the committee a couple examples of why FDA's current regulations are not a good fit for medical gases?
Sure, and I think first of all, I'd like to, because I don't think I testified for it, we do feel very fortunate that we have the FDA. We have,
absolutely, and we're working well with the FDA, and it's an excellent agency.
We've existed before the FDA came along, and then the two of us have been working down this precarious path of discretionary enforcement, and we're fortunate that we share the same principles, that we want to send our employees home safe at night, and we want our patients to be safe. So I think that's critical to say that we've been keeping it together because we're fortunate that the CGA and the FDA work so closely together. Having said that, the medical gases fall under a pharmaceutical standard, yet our manufacturing processes are different, our containers that hold the drugs are different, and the characteristics of our drugs are different. From a manufacturing standpoint, a typical pharmaceutical company may have one plant that distributes their product nationally or perhaps even globally. We have 4,500 plants in the U.S. producing and selling oxygen, which occurs in a very tight radius of about 100 miles. And in terms of our containers, many of you probably have loved ones that you've seen on oxygen. They pull around a cylinder, which is about 2,000 psi under pressure. After it is empty, we pick it up, bring it back to our location, and refill it. If the label, if you can still see the label, is still good working condition, it stays on there. Or in large cases, you might see it at a hospital, a large cryogenic container where as it gets low, we come to fill it. You compare that to a typical disposable pill box that gets thrown away. And then the characteristics of most of our medical gases are on the periodic table. They never expire, which is very different from pharmaceutical.
Thank you. And what would the effect, in your opinion, be on patients if the FDA were to require an NDA, a new drug application for medical gases?
I think Dr. Woodcock said it very well today in her goals. It's having a safe, effective, and available product. And what gets me particularly concerned is the available if we have to go through an NDA process. An NDA is a long process to go through. We have 2 million patients alone on oxygen in the homes, not to mention in hospitals and doctor offices. So it could really have an impact on supply to these existing patients that we're supplying. And to what safety benefit? Our products have been being used, oxygen, we used as an example, have been being used for over 100 years. You could Google it and find physicians talking about oxygen therapy in the 1850s.
Thank you. Google it now, not 100 years ago.
Google it now, do not Google 150.
Do you see some problems in particular of the current system for small business medical gas manufacturers?
I do, and I said before, I started from a small business atmosphere, and if I would have known, I was very young when I started the business, but if I would have known now what I did now, I would not have started that business, because you're investing in something that is not approved. We can't, it's not under the approved drug status. Plus, if the FDA chose to enforce us to a strict pharmaceutical standard, many of the small companies would get out of the medical gas business.
Thank you. I look forward to working with Dr. Woodcock on this issue and with those on the panel. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
All right, any follow-up? Do you have a follow-up?
Mr. Chairman, I do, and first, and thank you for yielding. First, I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter, a statement from the California Healthcare Institute in support of H.R. 2182, the GAIN Act. Do I have unanimous consent to submit that for the record, Mr. Chairman? Yeah, certainly, certainly. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that, and I know the ranking member would like to look at it, and that's appropriate. I did want to ask one follow-up question, if you'll allow. This issue of stewardship, and again, I'll go back to Dr. Eisenstein. Is it Eisenstein or Eisenstein? Sounds good to me, yeah. So Dr. Eisenstein, this issue of stewardship, the judicious use of antibiotics, and this has come up a few times in testimony and from members of the panel today, and from the committee members. In fact, the ranking member, overall ranking member of the committee. So I want to ask you this, Dr. Eisenstein. Can we solve global resistance through a congressionally mandated stewardship program? And Dr. Powers, I think, referred to this as well. Or other forms, like maybe the World Health Organization, better suited to tackle this issue of antibiotic resistance from overuse, overprescribing, et cetera?
That's an excellent point. The problem with drug-resistant organisms, Dr. Gingrey, as you know, is they know no boundary. So when the New Delhi beta metalloproteinase was discovered in strains of Klebsiella and other gram-negatives in India, within 6 to 12 months, we saw patients infected in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, et cetera. I was at a meeting recently where an individual went to an unnamed southeastern country in Asia and showed 5 different pharmacies, one after another, where any individual could go into any one of those stores and choose any antibiotic, essentially, that they wanted. But I'd like to, so that this is a much broader problem, and clearly stewardship must be part of the solution. I would submit, though, that that is not the place for the GAIN Act.
Well, I thank you for that, and very quickly, Mr. Chairman, and I will go to Dr. Powers now, because Dr. Powers, you had sort of suggested just a few minutes ago that maybe there ought to be some federal mandate in regard to best practices and how infectious disease specialists such as yourself should prescribe antibiotics in the most judicious and efficacious manner. It would seem to me that maybe that should come from the American Academy of Infectious Disease subspecialists in their best practices paradigm. But you seem to think, if I understand your testimony correctly, that maybe the federal government should do that. Would you suggest that that would be within the auspices of the FDA, or maybe from some other government bureaucracy such as IPAB?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. To answer the question you asked to Dr. Eisenstein, resistance is both global and local, and that is that there have been countries where their antibiotic usage has decreased, where they've been able to decrease local resistance. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a global approach. I think what I was trying to suggest was that FDA should have the authority to be able to designate drugs for special usage. That doesn't mean they're regulating the practice of medicine or telling doctors how to use it, but having worked at FDA, I certainly understand the importance of giving doctors the information they need to be able to practice appropriately. That's more what I was suggesting, not that FDA should designate who can use what. And I think that means working with those other outside organizations and developing stewardship programs at hospitals.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. And if Dr. Eisenstein wanted to make another comment, is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, just to continue on two points that I'd like to make, or actually 3 points. One of them, in terms of the FDA being able to approve a drug because it happens to get a very bad organism, you still have to, the manufacturer still has to go through normal procedures to demonstrate efficacy, which means that the drug is better than placebo, and that the agency has got to designate it, therefore approved on that basis. That's point number one. Point number two, practice in medicine, as you know, as a former practicing physician, has changed dramatically over 40 years. I graduated from medical school 40 years ago, and antibiotics were used essentially willy-nilly at that time. In the last 10, 15 years, the stewardship that we see already in place in hospitals is so exact. We could not get our own antibiotic on formularies anywhere in this country without it being severely restricted, so that only infectious disease experts were able to give the approval for the use of that drug. And in part because of that, we believe Cubicin, the drug that we now have had approved for 8.5 years, still has a 99.9% susceptibility rate against MRSA, despite 8.5 years on the market. So we can use drugs appropriately, and they have been used appropriately. And lastly, I'd just like to wholeheartedly agree with the Society of Infectious Disease Pharmacists, who noted that inclusion of stewardship language in the GAIN Act may broaden the scope of the Act and take the focus away from the appropriate incentives that we're talking about. If you try to put too much in the way of disincentives back in this bill, you're actually creating the same problem that we're trying to solve.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. And the unanimous consent request of Dr. Gingrey with the letters is approved. Chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask Mr. Walsh, you heard Dr. Woodcock, who's still here on the first panel, say that FDA is concerned with the concept of creating an entirely new regulatory structure for medical gases. And she said she would be willing to meet with you personally to discuss whether there are other ways to address the Compressed Gas Association's concern short of legislation. So I was just going to ask you, I'm trying to get you together here, you see. Would you be willing to meet with Dr. Woodcock to see if there is a different solution here?
We definitely have an interest of working directly with Dr. Woodcock and her staff to come up with the actual legislation that can give us the guidelines or regulations specific for medical gases.
Okay, because I think it sounds like you have some valid concerns, but I just hope the FDA can be responsive and find a way to resolve these issues without actually having to pass legislation. That's my hope, so we'll see if you can get together. It would be helpful.
I do think legislation is important. We've been operating under the guidelines for many, many years, and so I think it's important that we have something very strict and by law that we can operate off of.
All right, well, let's see what develops out of the meeting in any case. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and I would like unanimous consent to enter into the record statements from the National Association of Chain Drug Stores and Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. I think you've seen this. Without objection, so ordered. That concludes panel 2. Thank you very much for your testimony, and we appreciate your patience. We'll now go to panel 3. And I'd like to call them to the witness table. I'd like to thank all of you for agreeing to testify before the subcommittee today. And I'll quickly introduce our final panel. First of all, Mr. Sean Brown is the Vice President of State Government Affairs at the Generic Pharmaceutical Association. Then we have Ms. Elizabeth Gallina, is the Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel for the Healthcare Distribution Management Association, and Mr. Tim Davis, who is the owner of the Beaver Health Mart Pharmacy and representing the National Community Pharmacists Association, and Mr. Alan Cockle, the Director of Medical Programs at the Pew Health Group. Again, thank all of you for coming. We have your prepared statements. Mr. Brown, we'll begin with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You want to hit your mic there? Yeah.
Sorry about that. Good morning, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. Thank you for inviting me to testify before the subcommittee on the important topic of securing our nation's pharmaceutical supply chain. I am Sean Brown, Vice President of State Affairs at the Generic Pharmaceutical Association. GPHA represents the manufacturers and distributors of finished dose generic pharmaceuticals and suppliers of other goods and services to the generic industry. We appreciate the efforts of members of this committee, particularly Congressman Matheson and Bill Bray, to address this important issue, and we share their goal of ensuring the security of our supply chain. For many years, GPHA has worked closely with multiple stakeholders across the supply chain to ensure U.S. consumers benefit from the safest and most secure prescription drug supply in the world. Both industry and FDA are exceptionally vigilant against the distribution and sale of counterfeit and adulterated medicines. GPHA believes the problem of counterfeit medicines raises a significant public health concern that must be addressed on a range of levels, from local to global and throughout the drug supply chain. Our commitment to this issue is further evidenced by the Generic Drug User Fee Act, which recognizes that while providing earlier access to effective medicines is critical, FDA's central mission is ensuring drug safety. It is worth noting that generic drugs are rarely, if ever, targeted by counterfeiters. The primary focus of counterfeiters is on more profitable and expensive brand name products. GPHA is not aware of a single instance of a counterfeit generic product occurring within the normal chain of distribution in the U.S. Nevertheless, the generic industry has been a leader in supporting numerous anti-counterfeiting efforts and developing methods to further protect the integrity of the pharmaceutical supply chain. As these efforts move forward, however, it is vital to ensure that any system is practical, focused, and uniform across the country. A uniform system founded on reliable technology and business practices would avoid creating cost barriers to the distribution of safe and effective medicines. For example, some anti-counterfeiting efforts, such as the California model taking effect in 2015, would require implementation of full unit-level track and trace capabilities, where theoretically the entire distribution history and location of every unit in the supply chain can be determined at any time. GPHA believes that adoption of the California model, or a similar one, would raise the cost of medicine by billions of dollars over time, would be prone to error, and would have at best similar results to the less expensive, more efficient model that we support. With billions of units moving quickly and efficiently through the supply chain to fill more than 4 billion prescriptions per year, the magnitude and complexity of such a system is not technically feasible. The California law does include language providing for preemption of its requirements in the event that federal legislation is enacted. With California's initial effectiveness date fast approaching, GPHA has helped lead an effort to develop a more efficient model. In partnership with stakeholders from every area of the pharmaceutical supply chain, the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance, or PDSA, has developed a consensus technological model that we believe will deliver greater patient safety and help to achieve FDA's stated goals for a supply chain security system. The PDSA is a multi-stakeholder initiative whose membership spans the U.S. pharmaceutical distribution system, including manufacturers, wholesale distributors, third-party logistics providers, and pharmacies. As a member of the PDSA, GPHA strongly supports the Alliance's proposed electronic traceability system known as the Pharmaceutical Traceability Enhancement Code, or RxTech. This system would increase patient access to safe medicines, while improving the security of our country's drug distribution system. In addition, the RxTech system would aid state and federal agencies in tracing the distribution history of suspect products, replace the inconsistent and inefficient patchwork of state laws, increase efficiency throughout the drug distribution system, and establish foundational technology for future enhancements. The PDSA model is based on technological solutions that are achievable and scalable. And unlike a full track and trace system, which is not technically feasible in the near term, the RxTech system would provide immediate measures to increase supply chain security. The legislation would provide regulators with new authorities to establish new penalties to address counterfeit products, cargo theft, and illegal online drug sellers, and create new rules regarding e-labeling that will increase patient safety. It would also improve the efficiency and effectiveness of drug recalls and returns, and enable healthcare providers to leverage technology for record-keeping purposes. We urge the inclusion of the proposal in the user fee package to accomplish these goals. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, GPHA and the industry share the concerns of the committee with regard to maintaining the security of our drug supply and preventing the entry of counterfeit, diverted, stolen, or other substandard medicines. The development of a uniform national system is needed to give regulatory authorities another tool for enforcement, make it more difficult for criminals to breach the supply chain, and enhance the ability of the supply chain to respond quickly when a breach has occurred. We believe the RxTech model proposed by the PDSA achieves all of these goals. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Ms. Galina, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the Subcommittee on Health. I'm Liz Galina, Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel at HDMA. Thank you for the opportunity to inform the subcommittee today regarding this critically important issue of prescription drug pedigree, traceability, and pharmaceutical supply chain safety. I would also like to thank Congressman Bilbray and Matheson for their bipartisan leadership in this area. The pharmaceutical distribution industry's primary mission is to operate the safest, most secure, and efficient supply chain in the world. As part of this mission, HDMA's members work to eliminate counterfeit and diverted medicines by capitalizing on the technological innovation and constant improvements in efficiency that are the foundation of our industry. Today, I'm here to express HDMA's strong support for a national uniform approach to pedigree and the traceability of medicines throughout the supply chain. HDMA believes that reform should have tighter wholesaler licensing standards and a new federal ceiling for pedigree requirements to improve safety and uniformity across the country while establishing targets and parameters for longer-term electronic traceability solutions. In addition to fundamentally addressing counterfeit and diverted medicines, we also believe that federal pedigree may have some potential as a useful tool in discouraging gray market activity associated with drug products in short supply. After many years of debate, 2012 is the best window of opportunity to enact national pedigree legislation. This is in large part due to broad consensus among supply chain partners, as well as the possibility of attaching national pedigree and traceability provisions to PDUFA reauthorization. Basic guidelines for pedigree were set forth nearly 25 years ago with the enactment of the federal PDMA. Since that time, activity at the state level has varied, with some enacting complex electronic pedigree laws and others never going further than the original 1988 guidelines. Based on our experience, the complexities of dealing with multiple approaches in the states will only get worse if we fail to solve this problem now at the national level. Since Florida's first foray into raising pedigree and licensure requirements in 2003, we've seen dramatic variation across the country in both legislative activity and regulatory interpretation. This has occurred despite our attempts to work in every state, along with our fellow stakeholders and interested legislators, to achieve more uniformity. Today, for example, 29 states have acted beyond the federal PDMA standards. For instance, the states of California and Florida are thought to be the most stringent and leaders in this area. However, they take completely different viewpoints, with Florida considered to be the most stringent today and California thought to be the most complex in the future in 2015 when their law is implemented. This patchwork not only creates operational challenges, but also creates openings for bad actors to shop for more lenient state rules, openings that could mean the difference between a fake or diverted medicine being dispensed or administered to an innocent patient in need of treatment. Because of this state-by-state variation, we believe that pedigree and traceability should be under the purview of Congress and the FDA. HDMA is currently part of an industry alliance, a consortium of other industry partners called the PDSA. PDSA's consensus model calls for the following: national requirements for wholesaler licensing standards and for direct purchase and standard pedigree upon the effective date of the legislation, manufacturer serialization at the unit and case levels, enabling unique identification of prescription drug products for the first time, the development of electronic systems to facilitate traceability and transaction data exchange to provide additional efficiency and safety benefits within the supply chain, appropriate transition time and development phases for the migration to traceability for each segment of the supply chain. Further, federal legislation must also preserve the critically important role of the states, for instance, in the area of wholesaler licensure and enforcement. There is no single element that will protect the supply chain from every threat, but rather a comprehensive solution should incorporate each of these elements. We urge the subcommittee to consider this important issue for inclusion in PDUFA legislation. Now is the time for Congress to act to bring cohesion and consistency to our national drug supply chain. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Dr. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for conducting this hearing and providing me an opportunity to share my views and my perspective as an independent pharmacist on the issue of securing the pharmaceutical supply chain. My name's Tim Davis of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and I own the Beaver Health Mart Pharmacy in that town and county. Been a practicing pharmacist for 12 years, and I'm here today representing the National Community Pharmacists Association. It's an association of over 23,000 independent pharmacists, and we are the pharmacists that represent over 40% of the prescriptions dispensed in this country. It is my belief that the pharmaceutical supply chain in the United States is largely safe and secure. I believe that today most practicing pharmacists have a heightened awareness of the possibility of counterfeit or diverted drugs and therefore recognize the critical importance of purchasing medications only from trusted wholesalers or trading partners. In addition, most pharmacists today make a concerted effort to carefully examine and make note of drug packaging and the appearance of the drug itself to make sure that there are no suspicious anomalies. It's been my observation that certain types of prescription medications tend to be the target of counterfeiters. High-dollar medications that can be easily produced and readily sold generally enable counterfeiters to create an attractive profit margin. Presently, generics are not typically a target for this type of activity. Some drugs that I have seen are particularly susceptible and are lifestyle drugs such as Viagra, as well as a number of very expensive injectable medications, and most recently, Avastin. These are typically not carried in community pharmacies, but rather dispensed through consolidated specialty pharmacies or directly through physicians. In my career, I've seen an example of counterfeiting at the local level. We received manufacturer information that a particular drug had entered the drug supply chain in counterfeit form, and the manufacturer instructed us on how to recognize the genuine product versus the fake. Upon a receipt of a daily shipment in the morning from our wholesale distributor, we checked and found that the item we received was indeed one of the counterfeit products. We immediately contacted and discussed the situation with the wholesaler. Our answer was to stop doing business with them due to lack of believable responses. That being said, NCPA does believe that there are a number of different approaches or tactics that could be employed to provide further confirmation of this integrity. These strategies could include national uniform federal licensure standards for wholesale distributors, increased oversight or security measures to deter pharmaceutical cargo theft and illegitimate online drug sellers, and lot-level form of tracking for prescription drugs to assist the FDA or state authorities in the event of recall or to investigate suspect product. Raising the standards for wholesaler licensure in a uniform fashion would provide the community pharmacist at any location in the United States with an additional layer of confidence in the integrity of the medications purchased from such companies. Therefore, NCPA recommends that the U.S. government set national, uniform, and federal licensure standards for wholesale distributors. At the present time, these distributors are licensed at the individual state level, which has resulted in a patchwork of requirements of varying rigor. There are a number of other approaches that could also further secure the pharmaceutical supply chain. S1002, the Safe Doses Act, would expand the penalties for pharmaceutical cargo theft. And in addition, HR 4095, the Online Pharmacy Safety Act, would create a publicly available whitelist of legitimate internet pharmacies. This list would help to eliminate rogue internet pharmacies that exist and often prey on consumers looking for bargain-priced medications. NCPA is a member of the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance, a working group comprised of representatives from all sectors of the pharmaceutical supply chain. It's been collaborating on a comprehensive proposal to address supply chain security issues. The RX Tech Act is currently in draft form. However, it includes language that would create the registry of legitimate online pharmacy websites, increase the penalties for counterfeiters, as well as provide for tracking of prescription medications at the lot level. The actual tracking of prescription drugs through the supply chain is a topic that has been discussed for a number of years, and independent community pharmacists have had significant concerns in the past about the cost of the hardware, software, and employment burdens that placed upon the association. This is a complex issue both in terms of the technologies necessary to implement it, as well as the fact that each of the sectors involved in the supply chain operate under very different business models and vary greatly in terms of financial resources and technological sophistication. Community pharmacies are largely small businesses. Any system that would require pharmacists to electronically scan each item would create a burdensome and time-consuming exercise that would further limit the amount of time that we have to provide patient care and counseling, or any other activities necessary to keep that small business running. The tracking system proposed under RX Tech Act is one that is lot-based tracking, would require that the encoded information on each unit be both machine and human readable, and would allow for collaboration between all members of the supply chain. The proposed system is one that could be built upon in the future if it was determined that this course of action was advisable, but it is one that would not impose an undue burden, either financially or as it relates to workflow, upon independent community pharmacists. I have a greater degree of confidence in the United States drug supply than I did just a few years ago, largely due to heightened awareness of those in the supply chain and the possibility of counterfeit or diverted medications being discovered. That being said, community pharmacies take very seriously our role in ensuring the safety of medications that we personally dispense to our patients, and we remain committed to working with our colleagues in the supply chain, other pharmacy organizations, wholesalers, and manufacturers, as well as with state and federal authorities to make any needed improvements. Moving forward, is it essential that all stakeholders make a concerted effort to keep the lines of communications open so that consumers can continue to implicitly trust the integrity of the medications that they depend on. I thank you and welcome any questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize Mr. Cockle for 5 minutes for a statement.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to present testimony. Thank you for your work on this issue, and especially to Representatives Bilbray and Matheson for introducing a bipartisan bill that would help protect Americans from counterfeit and diverted drugs. My name is Alan Cockle. I'm a pharmacist and Director of Medical Programs for the Pew Health Group of the Pew Charitable Trusts. The safety of the drug supply has been a long-term focus for Pew. Last year we issued a major report, and one of the key findings was that we currently have no national system to detect or prevent counterfeits. And with close to 2,000 individual wholesalers and many more individual pharmacies and actors, it provides multiple points of entry to our system. Let me illustrate the risks with just a few examples of diversion, theft, and counterfeiting. First, the black market for diversion and resale of drugs that have already been dispensed to patients and paid for, often by Medicaid. 2 years ago, federal officials in Florida brought down a ring that illegally purchased $13 million worth of prescription drugs, buying them from patients, and then selling them to pharmacies through a licensed wholesaler in Texas. Similar schemes have been documented in other states. Drug theft is another threat. In 2009, thieves stole a tractor trailer containing 129,000 vials of insulin. After disappearing for several months, some of this temperature-sensitive drug was later found on the shelves of chain pharmacies in Texas, Georgia, and Kentucky. In another case, thieves cut through the roof of an Eli Lilly warehouse in Connecticut using forklifts to load a truck with $75 million worth of prescription drugs. The fate of those drugs isn't known, but some experts believe that the thieves may be letting the alarm die down before selling them back into the system. And then finally, we have incidents of outright counterfeits. In recent weeks, a counterfeit cancer drug, Avastin, made its way reportedly from Egypt through multiple European countries to a licensed U.S. pharmaceutical wholesaler that had been supplying numerous clinics. In 2001, counterfeit Serostim, a high-cost injectable for AIDS patients, was found in at least 7 states and passed through multiple wholesalers. The manufacturer of that drug has since put in place a secured distribution program with a unique serial number assigned to each vial that must be verified by the dispensing pharmacy. Unlike for that drug, for most drugs there is currently no way to check whether they're authentic or counterfeit. Some state laws exist. California is implementing a comprehensive system under which manufacturers will put a unique serial number on each unit, and wholesalers and pharmacies will check to ensure that the drugs they buy and sell are authentic. A strong national standard would be preferable to a patchwork of state laws, but a national system has been under discussion for years and won't happen without legislation. Congress is now considering a compromise proposal developed between various industry sectors, and Pew supports a number of the elements of this proposal, including strengthened standards for wholesaler licensure. But the proposal falls short in a couple of crucial aspects. First, the key to improved security of drug distribution is knowing who handles the drugs as they move from manufacturer through a succession of wholesalers to the pharmacy or the hospital and ultimately to the patient. The industry proposal calls for tracking drugs at the lot level, but a lot, as we heard already this morning, can contain numerous cases or many thousands of individual bottles, and each case or individual unit can be sold separately. And tracking by lot doesn't allow industry or regulators to ever know who bought and sold a given drug. Maintaining data about lots may provide an incremental benefit over the status quo, but it would fail to catch unsafe drugs in many scenarios. If part of a lot was stolen and illicitly reintroduced into commerce, a pharmacist or a patient would have no way to tell if the product on their shelf was compromised. That same lot will be sitting on the shelves of dozens or hundreds of pharmacies. But if individual units are tracked, specific stolen bottles could be identified. While the PDSA proposal would result in a unique serial number being placed on each unit of sale, keeping track of the drugs would be impossible unless the serial numbers can be associated with the case in which they're shipped. Even if we decide that we don't need unit-level tracing now, the PDSA system proposed would make it difficult or impossible to track drugs at the unit level in the future. Next, under the proposed system, neither the pharmacy nor any other party in the system would ever be required to verify the authenticity of drugs. A criminal could sell a vial of counterfeit drug with a fake serial number, and no one would detect it because no one will be required to check it. Pew supports required authentication of drug products by the companies involved in distribution, as outlined in H.R. 3026, the Bilbray-Matheson bill. Let me conclude by noting again that the impending California law creates momentum for a single national standard. Such a standard should protect Americans today and provide the flexibility for future refinements. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks all the witnesses, and we'll begin questioning. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for that purpose. Let me ask a question to all of you first. You can each respond. We're all concerned about the safety of our drug supply, and we want to ensure that diverted drugs and counterfeit drugs do not reach our nation's patients. However, as we look at policies to help, we also have to think about the cost to our nation's small businesses. They're struggling right now. We need to take them into account as we analyze every policy idea. First question, how do we ensure the safety of our prescription drugs in the most cost-effective way? And then, two, why is a national standard necessary? Mr. Brown?
I think I would say the PDSA model, we've got a consensus throughout industry from chain drugstores to independent pharmacy, secondary wholesalers, third-party logistics providers, brand and generic manufacturers. We believe this is a scalable system and a feasible system that we're proposing. And I think that this will help to achieve all of FDA's stated goals, one of which being to prevent introduction and to help identification of counterfeit medicines. We are concerned about the cost as well, but the system that we're proposing is exponentially less than the system would be if we had to implement the California model, which we don't think is technically feasible.
Ms. Gallagher?
I would agree with Mr. Brown. We believe that the best approach is something that is done at the national level, and our members have told us that it would be more cost-effective to operate the RX Tech proposal that PDSA has put forth and that we've worked on rather than work toward California and then deal with potentially New York or Illinois or whatever state is next in this arena. We're already, as wholesalers, we see firsthand the 50-state patchwork that you hear so much about, and that really is a reality for our members in terms of dealing with 50 different laws. And so automatically, we think that we get greater efficiencies and cost benefits from going with the PDSA proposal.
Dr. Davis?
The PDSA proposal also looks at the problem in a multifaceted approach. The only place that rogue pharmacies can get counterfeit or diverted medications are from rogue wholesalers. So we need to look upstream. I think the PDSA looks at creating national standards to help us feel that the drug supply above us is intact. I also feel that it takes a look at the rules and regulations set against counterfeiters to prevent that sort of activity long before it gets to a pharmacy level. And I think that the infrastructure built on the serialization and lot numbers included in the RX Tech Act prepare this for adaptation in the future. We need a system that's going to adapt to the healthcare needs of the near future, not necessarily the legislative needs that we foresee coming. And this market is going to continue to change, and the products that we're going to experience are going to continue to change, positioning us very well to scale effectively.
Mr. Cockle?
Mr. Chairman, along with the compliance, or the cost of compliance that my colleagues raised, I think the other argument for a national system is that the companies involved in drug distribution work across state lines. So in the case of Avastin, it was a Tennessee licensed wholesaler that sold the drugs, but they ended up in Illinois, Texas, and California, or at least those are the practices that have been mentioned. So that argues for a national standard, and clearly we have to do it in the way that has the least necessary cost impact. So it's important to say, what are the goals of the system? Do we want to be able to identify counterfeit drugs when they come in? And if so, what's the most effective way to do that? And secondly, do we want to be able to track product as it moves through the system? And what's the most cost-effective way to track the product at the level we want to be tracking it at? One of our concerns with the proposal is that companies are going to make a capital investment to be able to serialize their product, and we certainly recognize that they're stepping forward to do that. And I think the question we have to ask is, if we think that eventually we want to get to a system where we're tracking individual units, and we're putting in place an infrastructure now that is lot-level tracking, are we going to be back here in 5 or 8 years when we have a crisis because we have counterfeit drugs on the shelves, asking them to invest again in a new system that tracks at the unit level, or should we get it right now?
Mr. Brown, can you speak, what would the cost be to manufacturers if the California approach were adopted?
Yes, I can give you an approximate estimate. If we think about the number of packaging lines that serve the consumers in the U.S., it's about 3,000. I've heard some estimates higher, some lower. And per packaging line, my manufacturers tell me that it ranges between $500,000 and $1 million per packaging line. So if it's the highest, I would say it's near $3 billion just to implement the camera infrastructure. We're not talking about the data management costs or the cost of 2D barcodes, the ongoing costs. We're just talking about getting the infrastructure set up into the packaging lines.
My time's expired. Chair recognizes Ranking Member, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask, actually, each of the panelists this question. In addition to the various provisions related to development of the RX Tech system, the proposal from the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance contains a number of provisions related to federal licensing of parties involved in the manufacture and distribution of pharmaceuticals. I understand these provisions are intended to create federal uniformity for the regulation of these parties and could help prevent bad actors from engaging in the drug supply chain. But I'd like to ask each of you if you support the provisions requiring federal licensure for manufacturers, distributors, repackagers, and third-party logistic providers, and if not, what concerns they have. And I'm just looking for a yes or no at this point.
Yes.
Because I want to move on. Yes? Ms.
We
Gallant?
support the provisions that are contained in the proposal, but if I could clarify, on the wholesaler licensure piece, we support federal standards and still retain the issuance of licenses with the state.
Okay.
We agree with that.
Dr.
as well.
Davis, you agree with that?
We agree as well.
Okay. Mr. Cockle?
As do we.
Okay. Now, let me ask Mr. Cockle. I understand that from the patient safety perspective, the best system would be one in which the pedigree system goes to the unit level. You talked about this, and in which the pharmacist verifies the pedigree of all the units he receives for dispensing. I also understand that the current industry proposal does not have serialization information down at the unit level, but it enables tracing back only to the lot level. You stated that, or one of you did. Meanwhile, that proposal does not require pharmacists to verify any pedigree information whatsoever before dispensing, although it would facilitate trace back once a problem has been identified. So it appears that the industry proposal does not go as far as some would like, and certainly does not as far as the California law appears to go. However, what many of us have heard is that the California law is proving much more difficult to implement than anticipated, and that the industry plan can serve as a building block towards reaching the goal that California law sets out. So my question, I'll ask you first, Mr. Kogel, is do you agree with that, what I just said, or do you see the industry proposal as a step that, while containing many useful items, ultimately points or puts a roadblock in front of ever reaching unit-level tracing and verification? And then I'll ask Ms. Gallant if you'd respond as well.
Thank you for that question. If I could begin with one point of clarification. Under the industry proposal, there would be a unique serial number on each vial. It just wouldn't be tracked as it moved through the system. So potentially, on a case-by-case basis, somebody could look that up and check it. But what you don't have is, at the point when there's no suspicion, that vial being checked. And you know, these counterfeits are pretty good. You can't, by the naked eye, in a lot of cases, detect them. And so there's no system here where a flag is automatically thrown up. So I think that the key question in looking at how to move forward is, what are the basic elements that we want now, and what are the basic elements that we're going to want within a reasonable time frame, and does this system give us enough to build on? And as I said already, we're a little concerned that if we go with this system, then we may not be able to get where we need to go in the future.
Okay. Ms. Gallant?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I think a couple of things in this arena. One, to agree with Mr. Kuckel's explanation. There is an SNI, or serial number, included in the RX Tech data. So the 2D barcode would include the SNI information as well as lot and expiration. What we think is that that would alone, for the first time, provide unique identification of medicines, and would be a very big step for the industry. Today, we don't have that at all, and we are dealing with paper and electronic, sometimes, always lot level, and no real standard in terms of what different states are doing across the country. I think we also would think that going with the PDSA proposal is not a roadblock, but sticking with the 50-state patchwork may be a roadblock to actually ever getting to a true electronic system across the country. I think that, you know, we need to take a broader perspective of this issue, and that patient safety really does belong in the purview of Congress right now. Right now is probably the best opportunity that we have, and we do have industry consensus, and that's something that we have never achieved before. And so I think that that goes a long way. And I believe that members, my members, other industry partners, once those things are in place that are put forth in the PDSA proposal, like unit level serialization, I think that building on the innovation that we've built on in the past and the efficiencies that can be achieved as we learn more about the technology, we may eventually find other uses for the technology, and it may go further than what we have initially set out to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Davis, you were probably in the room earlier when Dr. Woodcock was here, and you heard our exchange about the drug shortages. She had been here 3 or 4 weeks ago, and this was a lot of follow-up to that. Can you tell me, from the community pharmacist perspective, what you're encountering in the drug shortage arena?
We, a single day doesn't go by where drug shortages don't affect patients in one manner or another. So of the hundreds of prescriptions that we fill daily in my pharmacies, we know we have to have a conversation every single day with a patient to alter therapy, to choose a different therapy, or to come to a consensus with the prescribers and other caregivers as to how to change therapy to still get the best result for that patient without the agent available that we need.
Can you give us some examples of how that might come up in the course of your day? What are the ones you're seeing very frequently? You heard my exchange with Dr.
Correct.
Woodcock. You had an executive order in October, and as far as I could tell, not a darn thing happened. But then when we had a very intense discussion about Doxil 3 or 4 weeks ago, suddenly you got some movement on that, and people were able to find, oh yeah, there is some supply that we can free up. So help me here. Tell me what you're having the most trouble with. I'll write a letter to Dr. Woodcock. We'll see what we can do.
The most troubles arising, mostly solid dosage forms. At the community pharmacy level, we dispense very few injectable medications or infusible medications. So the cancer drugs that you're referencing are not necessarily a problem in the community, but what we do see are the ADHD medications, okay. Solid dosage forms of those, medications in some neurological disorders as well. Methotrexate has been recently a problem for us in the treatment of RA. In a couple of other disease states. And in those cases, they're patients that were managed and well managed on these medications, and now we have disruption of therapy. So we have to make a decision of can we still achieve the clinical outcomes with another agent? And it's proving to be burdensome. It's proving to burn time that we shouldn't necessarily have to burn because this patient's already been managed effectively and efficiently within the system.
How involved do you get with the cost of prescriptions? I get to do a number of telephone town halls with other members of Congress because they like for me to be there, and invariably the caller calls in and they're on whatever, and it's frightfully expensive, and then you kind of know at the back of your mind there's a generic available for that. It probably is much less. How do you handle that at the community pharmacy level when someone is having difficulty paying for their medication, and there might be a generic, or there might be something that's just a little bit different, but perhaps suitable? Do you communicate with the physician, the prescribing physician in those instances?
Absolutely. Something to keep in mind is we're probably the only healthcare professional that actually gets to see the cost of care as it's rendered. Mm-hmm. So as someone standing in front of us approaching the instance of therapy, we know what that's going to cost and how that's going to impact that patient. We're also the only professional that still has a one-on-one and time to render to those patients to help them understand and navigate the waters associated with the cost of those medications. So we do reach out to our prescribers in the community and offer recommendations based on what we understand to be the outcomes and efficacy of that drug, still maintaining the integrity of the intent of that prescriber, but being able to do it at a lower cost. Pharmacists are doing it each and every day, over and over again throughout their day. It's not necessarily a recognized function, but we've transitioned from being the makers of salves and potions into clinically based social workers and helping people to navigate Medicare, helping people to navigate Medicaid, helping people to understand what's going on with the PBMs and the cost of their medications.
Let me ask you this, because the issue of Avastin came up, and I got to admit, a couple of weeks ago, I was pretty taken by surprise. I mean, I get why Viagra might be a counterfeit, and why there might be a market, why the incredible markup that occurs on that. But Avastin is hardly something you would just buy on the internet and use. What is going on there?
So the concern that I have is it's a high dollar medication.
Sure.
So it clearly, to be able to counterfeit and move that into the supply chain puts a lot of value not only on the people that are actually counterfeiting it and entering it in the supply chain, but the hands that may touch it during the supply chain itself. And that's why I said the integrity of our trading partners is of utmost importance, especially being the end dispenser of that. So to understand the components of the supply chain that come before us, to understand who your wholesaler is, to understand the integrity associated with that wholesaler, and how they conduct business is vital to what we do at the community and ground level. With the case of Avastin, I understand that particular medication changed hands through multiple sources, multiple times after entering this country, and was not necessarily entered through the channels that we would normally consider as part of the trusted lines of trade.
Wasn't in the legitimate stream of pharmaceutical commerce.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. That concludes our third and final panel. This has been very informative. We thank you, all of you, for your testimony. I will remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I'd like to ask the Secretary and witnesses to respond to the questions promptly.